The layers of any great mystery do not announce themselves all at once. They settle quietly, like silt drifting to the bottom of a still lake, waiting for the patient observer who is willing to look past what floats near the surface. Pokémon has existed in the world since 1996, and in that time it has accumulated secrets, curiosities, half-buried legends, and strange corners of code that most players never come close to seeing. The franchise stretches from the earliest Game Boy cartridges all the way through decades of handhelds and home consoles, and woven through all of it is a deep current of mystery that never quite resolves. And before we dig deep into This Iceberg, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The iceberg is a useful image for understanding how knowledge pools inside a fandom as large as this one. Near the surface, you find things most players recognize: the truck near the SS Anne, the story of Missing No, the playground rumors that spread from child to child like quiet folklore. These are the well-lit parts of the iceberg, the layers that even casual fans have heard mentioned at some point. But beneath those familiar stories, the iceberg descends through progressively stranger territory, into regions where the facts are harder to verify, where fan interpretation and documented history blur together, where the line between what the developers intended and what players imagined begins to soften. The Pokémon Iceberg is not a single document or a single image. It is an ongoing conversation, and the further down you go, the quieter and stranger that conversation becomes. What makes this particular subject worth exploring slowly in the manner of something that earns its revelations is that the Pokémon franchise is genuinely layered in ways that reward patient attention. A sprite that seemed unremarkable in 1999 might reveal, upon close inspection decades later, a detail that completely changes how a player thinks about a particular creature or a particular moment in the story. The iceberg, explored carefully, is less a collection of shocking facts and more a meditation on how much work goes into the games most people play without ever thinking much about the work itself. And so we begin near the surface, and we drift slowly downward into the parts of this world that only the curious tend to find. There was a truck. This is perhaps the most famous starting point for conversations about hidden things in Pokémon, and it has earned that position not because the truth is dramatic, but because the rumor around it became so much larger than the object itself. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, versions released for the Game Boy, players who explored the area near the SS Anne could sometimes catch a glimpse of a large truck sitting on a dock not far from the ship. The truck did not appear to serve any obvious purpose. It simply sat there, visible but inaccessible under normal gameplay conditions, and children in schoolyards around the world took that inaccessibility as a sign that something was being hidden. The most persistent rumor about the truck held that a Mew was sleeping underneath it, waiting to be discovered by any player clever enough to find the right method of moving the vehicle. Children traded theories about HM moves that could push objects, about surfing to the dock at a precise angle, about sequences of button presses that the game supposedly recognized as special inputs. None of these methods worked because there was nothing to find. The truck existed as a piece of environmental decoration, a detail that made the harbor feel more like a real place, and the designers almost certainly did not anticipate that its presence would generate years of speculation. The Mew underneath the truck became one of the foundational myths of the franchise, a small example of how the spaces in a game, the places that feel like they should contain something, have a way of filling themselves with the imagination of the people who play them. What is interesting about the truck story, considered from a quiet distance, is that it was partly enabled by the genuine mystery surrounding Mew's presence in the game at all. Mew was a real Pokémon, obtainable through a genuine in-game glitch, involving a specific sequence of events about near Nugget Bridge, and the developers had programmed it into the game as a kind of Easter egg near the end of development. Because Mew was real but difficult to officially obtain, because it had been distributed at special Nintendo events and whispered about in the way that only truly rare things get whispered about, the climate was exactly right for a story like The Truck to take hold. The inaccessibility of one mystery made every other inaccessible thing feel meaningful, and the truck became the vessel for all the longing that children felt about the Pokémon they hadn't managed to collect. Missing No is a name that carries more weight than almost any other two-syllable combination in gaming history. It is the name given to a specific glitch entity, or rather, to a family of glitch entities that could be encountered in the original Pokémon games through a particular sequence of actions involving the old man in Viridian City and the beach on the northern shore of Cinnabar Island. The glitch arose from how the game stored data about the player's name in a temporary memory location, and when that memory location was subsequently read as Pokémon encounter data, the result was a creature that the game did not know how to interpret. Missing No appeared in several visual forms, most famously as a scrambled block of pixels, but also as a ghostly outline and as a shape that resembled a skeleton bird seen from a distance. The practical effect of encountering Missing No was that the player's sixth item in their bag would have its quantity duplicated to the maximum possible value, a glitch that players quickly learned to exploit for duplicating rare candies or master balls. This made Missing No not just a curiosity, but a useful curiosity, something players sought out deliberately rather than stumbling upon by accident. The creature also had a genuine Pokédex number, or rather a number that the game processed as a Pokédex entry, in ways that sometimes produced unusual visual effects. For years, Missing No was surrounded by warnings that saving after encountering it would corrupt or delete a player's save file, a warning that was largely exaggerated, though certain variant glitch Pokémon from the same family did carry genuine risks to game data. What Missing No reveals about the architecture of the original games is something worth sitting with for a moment. The glitch exists because Game Freak, working under the significant constraints of the original Game Boy hardware, used memory locations in economical and sometimes unconventional ways. The same stretch of memory that stored information about an NPC's dialogue was later used to generate wild Pokémon encounters in a different part of the game, and the collision of those two uses produced something that the game's code had no prepared response for. Missing No is not a hidden Pokémon or an intentional secret. It is the game showing its seams, and those seams, once noticed, tell a story about the pressures and ingenuity that went into creating something on hardware that offered very little room for anything beyond the essential. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the landscape of Generation 1 more broadly and notice how many of its mysteries trace back to the same underlying cause, which is that the original games were built by a small team under unusual circumstances and finished in ways that left behind interesting traces. The development of Pokémon Red and Green, the versions released in Japan in 1996, reportedly came close to being canceled multiple times. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of the franchise, spent roughly 6 years working on the project with his studio Game Freak, and during that time the company nearly ran out of money on more than one occasion. Several staff members left during development, and those who remained worked in conditions that would be difficult to sustain. The finished games carried the marks of that difficult process in ways both obvious and subtle, and a significant portion of what the iceberg collects near its upper layers consists of things that exist because the original team was improvising under pressure. The GS Ball is one of those objects in Pokémon history that exists in a state of permanent incompleteness, and the story of how it arrived at that state is more interesting than the object itself. In the Pokémon anime, the GS Ball was introduced during the Orange Islands arc as a mysterious Pokéball that no one could open or identify. Professor Ivy, a researcher encountered during Ash's travels through the Orange Islands, had possession of the ball and could not determine its contents or purpose. She sent it to Professor Oak for further examination, and Oak in turn directed Ash to bring it to Kurt, a master craftsman of pokeballs who lived in Azalea Town in the Johto region. Kurt took the GS ball and said he needed time to study it. The ball was then largely forgotten by the anime's narrative. In an interview conducted years after the relevant episodes aired, the director Masamitsu Hidaka explained that the GS ball had originally been intended to contain Celebi and to serve as the focus of a significant story arc in Johto. The plan was for the arc surrounding the ball to build towards some kind of climax involving the mythical Pokémon. However, the decision was made to feature Celebi in the fourth theatrical Pokémon film instead, and once Celebi's role in the film was confirmed, the GS Ball storyline in the anime became redundant and was quietly abandoned. Kurt simply kept the ball, and no further mention was made of what it contained or whether it was ever opened. The arc that might have defined a portion of the Johto saga simply dissolved, and the GS ball remained in Kurt's house, an unanswered question rendered permanent by the shift of one mythical creature from a television storyline to a theatrical one. There is something quietly affecting about the GS ball as an object, not because of what it might have contained, but because of what its unresolved status represents. It is a reminder that narratives are not always concluded by intention. Sometimes they simply run out of room, or the direction changes, or the priorities of a large franchise shift in ways that leave smaller threads permanently hanging. The GS ball sits in Kurt's possession in a story that no one is coming back to finish, and that kind of incompleteness has a texture that feels different from a deliberate mystery. It is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is more like a room in a large house that was never quite furnished, closed off quietly rather than with ceremony. The relationship between Mew and Ditto has generated more theoretical conversation than almost any other pairing in the franchise, and the theories persist because the similarities between the two Pokémon are numerous enough to feel like they require explanation. Both creatures are pink in their standard coloring. Both possess shiny forms that are a similar shade of blue. Both weigh exactly 8.8 pounds, a coincidence precise enough to feel intentional. More significantly, both Mew and Ditto know the move Transform as their signature technique, a move that no other Pokémon learns naturally under any circumstances. Mew and Ditto share this ability exclusively, and the move itself, which allows the user to take on the appearance and stats of an opposing Pokémon, feels philosophically connected to what both creatures represent. The theory that Ditto might be a failed clone of Mew, or a creature derived from Mew in some way, draws additional support from the fact that in the original Pokémon games, Ditto could be encountered in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, the same location where scattered diary entries document early research into cloning Mew to produce Mewtwo. The presence of Ditto specifically in that location, rather than in the wild roots and caves where most Pokémon were found, felt like a quiet hint that the mansion's experiments had produced unintended byproducts. The theory was never confirmed by any official source during the early years of the franchise, and Game Freak maintained deliberate silence on the question for a long time, which allowed the speculation to deepen and spread. What is striking about the Mew-Ditto connection from a design perspective is that it demonstrates how suggestive the placement of details can be, even when no explicit confirmation exists. A Pokémon's weight, its moves, its location in the game world, the color of its shiny form, none of these individually would constitute evidence of anything. But when several such details align across two creatures simultaneously, the pattern becomes hard to dismiss as coincidence. Game Freak has historically been willing to let these kinds of implied connections exist without clarifying them, which is a form of storytelling that rewards the player who pays close attention without demanding that attention of anyone who simply wants to catch Pokemon and battle. The iceberg, in this sense, is partly constructed from deliberate ambiguity, and the Mew and Ditto connection is one of the cleaner examples of how that ambiguity generates lasting conversation. There is a building in Lumiose City in Pokemon X and Y that contains one of the stranger, unexplained moments in the franchise's recent history. Lumiose City is a large urban area modeled loosely on Paris, and like Paris, it contains many buildings that players can enter and explore. One particular building, accessed from the city streets, contains multiple floors reachable by elevator. A player who takes the elevator to the second floor will experience a brief sequence that the game does not explain. The lights cut out for a moment. When visibility returns, a female trainer of the Hex Maniac class is standing in the hallway, and she is moving without a walking animation, drifting across the floor in a way that suggests she does not quite belong to the same physical laws as everything else in the building. She delivers a single line, "You are not the one." Then she disappears. The Hex Maniac of Lumiose City has become one of the defining small mysteries of the 6th generation, more precisely because the game offers no context for who she is or what her message means. The encounter is brief, and the dialogue is cryptic, and the designers have not explained it in any interview or commentary that has surfaced since the game's release in 2013. Some players have connected her to a second Hex Maniac who can be found in Camphrier Town, who instructs the player not to speak to her because she is waiting to hear the elevator. The implication of a connection between the two characters has generated considerable speculation about what the game might be hinting at, but the speculation has produced no resolution. The building with the flickering lights sits in Lumiose City, and the trainer without a walking animation remains unexplained, a small ghost in a modern Pokemon city. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Generation 6 handled its atmosphere in general and notice that the Lumiose building moment is not an isolated instance of unexplained strangeness, but rather part of a consistent thread. The 6th generation games were set in a region inspired by France, and the design team made deliberate choices to give certain corners of the game a quality of unease that ran somewhat against the generally bright and welcoming tone that Pokemon games typically maintain. The routes around Laverre City carried a subdued, slightly melancholic quality. Certain NPC conversations touched on themes of loneliness and time in ways that felt more resonant than standard filler dialogue. The Hex Maniac encounter in the building fits within this broader design sensibility, suggesting that whoever made the decision to include it was working from a coherent vision of the game's emotional range, even if that vision was never explicitly explained to players. Before Gold and Silver were released outside of Japan, a particular image circulated through the early internet and gaming press that caused significant confusion among players who were anticipating the new games. The image showed a small blue rodent Pokemon that no one recognized, rendered in the pixel art style of the Game Boy Color games. The creature shared certain visual traits with Pikachu, including a round body and ears with pointed tips, and this similarity led some players to speculate that it might be a new form of Pikachu or a Pikachu-related evolution. Because the internet was in an early enough state that reliable information about unreleased games was difficult to find, the image spread with very little context attached to it, and the creature became something of a phantom, known widely but understood by almost no one. When Gold and Silver were released, and players had a chance to see the full new roster, they discovered that the blue rodent was simply Marill, a water-type Pokemon with a distinctive round tail ending in a sphere. Marill was not a Pikachu relative in any meaningful sense, sharing only the general rounded body shape that was common to many smaller Pokemon designs of the era. But before that reveal, the creature had accumulated its own set of playground rumors and theories a temporary mythology that dissolved as soon as the actual games arrived. The story of Meryl's misidentification is a small but clean example of how much interpretive pressure players are willing to apply to partial information, and how a few months of uncertainty can generate a denser web of speculation than the actual facts will ever support. Lavender Town has occupied a particular corner of the franchise's mythology since the original games were released, and the atmosphere it established has proven remarkably durable across more than 2 decades. The town sits in a quiet part of Kanto, adjacent to the Pokémon Tower, a multi-story building dedicated to the burial and commemoration of deceased Pokémon. The music that plays in Lavender Town was composed for the original Japanese releases, and it was designed to feel unsettling, a departure from the more energetic tracks that accompanied most of the game's locations. The music succeeded in creating an atmosphere unlike anything else in the original games, and that success planted seeds for a much larger mythology that grew around it over the following years. The most famous story associated with Lavender Town's original music is a creepypasta narrative that claims the music in the first Japanese release of Pokémon Red and Green contained high-frequency tones that caused adverse psychological effects in children who heard them. The story includes claims of nosebleeds, behavioral changes, and in its most extreme versions, fatalities among young players. The story is entirely fictional, a piece of creative writing that circulated on internet forums and accumulated details with each retelling in the manner characteristic of the creepypasta genre. The original Japanese music does differ slightly from the music that was used in international releases and subsequent Japanese re-releases, but the changes were minor revisions made as part of the general process of refining the games for different markets, not a response to any medical emergency. The legend, however, persists because the atmosphere it attaches itself to is genuinely there, and a genuinely unsettling piece of music is a much more receptive host for mythology than a cheerful one would be. The question of what happened to animals in the Pokémon world is one of those threads that, once pulled, produces more interesting tangles than players usually expect. In the earliest episodes of the anime, before the writers had fully committed to a consistent world-building framework, actual real-world animals were occasionally referenced or depicted. Fish appeared in aquariums, alongside Goldeen and Magikarp. A monkey was referenced in a way that suggested it was distinct from any known Pokémon species. Birds occasionally appeared in the background of outdoor scenes in ways that did not quite match any Pokémon design. These early inconsistencies were gradually eliminated as the anime's writers settled into a more coherent vision of the Pokémon world as a place where Pokémon had entirely replaced ordinary animals in every ecological niche, but the early episodes preserved the traces of a less fully committed approach. The games themselves have mostly maintained the position that the Pokémon world does not contain ordinary animals, but the Pokédex entries for certain creatures complicate this position considerably. Several Pokédex entries describe Pokémon by making comparisons to animals that presumably do not exist in the setting. Garchomp is called the mock Pokémon and compared to jet aircraft, which raises questions about the existence of human technology, but more significantly, entries describing creatures as resembling sharks or dolphins or bears seem to assume a frame of reference that would only make sense if players in the Pokémon world had some familiarity with those animals. The Pokédex sometimes reads as if it were written for readers in our world, using our world's animal kingdom as a reference, which creates a quiet tension with the premise that Pokémon have replaced those animals entirely. The sizes recorded in the Pokédex have long been a source of puzzlement and mild amusement among players who think carefully about what the numbers actually imply. The games record the height and weight of each Pokémon with apparent precision, And those numbers, when taken seriously, produce some results that are difficult to reconcile with how the creatures appear on screen or in the anime. Wailord, the float whale Pokemon, is recorded as 14.5 meters long, making it larger than a school bus, but it appears in battles and animations at a scale that implies something far smaller. Joltik, recorded at zero point 0.1 meters, or roughly 4 inches in length, appears in battles at approximately the same scale as Pikachu, who is 4 times its recorded size. The relationship between recorded measurements and visual presentation has never been entirely consistent, and the noted height of Furret, which the Pokédex records at a number that implies a creature considerably taller than it appears, has become something of a running conversation among players who enjoy examining the gap between data and depiction. The theory connecting Gengar and Clefable represents one of the more elaborated pieces of fan speculation about visual relationships in the original games, and it has enough support to warrant a careful look. Both Pokemon have roughly similar silhouettes when rendered as outlines: round bodies, pointed ears, stubby limbs, and expressions that suggest complex inner lives. Some players noticed that Gengar's silhouette in particular, when overlaid against Clefable's, showed a correspondence that felt too close to be entirely accidental. The theory extended to include the type relationship between the two creatures. Before Generation 6 introduced the Fairy type, Clefable was a normal type Pokemon, and Ghost type moves could not affect normal type Pokemon, which meant that Gengar could not directly damage Clefable, and Clefable could not damage Gengar. This mutual invulnerability, combined with the visual similarity, fed the theory that Gengar was some kind of dark reflection of Clefable, a shadow given form. The Clefairy line was, by some accounts, originally intended to serve a larger role in the franchise than it ultimately did. Early promotional materials for Pokemon suggested that Clefairy rather than Pikachu might become the face of the franchise, and certain early design documents apparently supported this idea. The reason the decision shifted toward Pikachu as the franchise mascot is not entirely clear from public information, but one widely cited explanation involves the practical consideration that yellow was more visually distinctive on merchandise and in television advertisements than the pink of Clefairy. The shift from Clefairy to Pikachu left Clefairy in a secondary position that it has maintained ever since, and the Gengar as shadow theory draws some of its resonance from the sense that Clefairy was once meant to be something more central than it became. The legendary beasts of Johto, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune carry origin stories that the games present with deliberate ambiguity, and the question of what those three creatures were before they were resurrected by Ho-Oh has been a persistent thread in fan discussion since Gold and Silver were released. The games state that Ho-Oh witnessed the destruction of the Brass Tower in Ecruteak City, which was struck by lightning and burned for 3 days, and that the legendary Phoenix resurrected 3 Pokemon that perished in the fire. The games do not state what those 3 Pokemon were. This gap in the official lore has encouraged a great deal of speculation, with various theories proposing that the original creatures were Eevee and 2 of its evolutions, or 3 specific Pokemon whose types matched the elemental attributes of the beasts, or simply 3 unnamed wild Pokemon who happened to be sheltering in the tower. The Eevee theory holds particular appeal because Ecruteak City is associated with the Pokemon that represents all possible evolutions, and the Kimono Girls, who serve as the city's most memorable characters, each use one of Eevee's evolutionary forms. If 3 Eevees perished in the tower and were reborn as elemental beings, the connection to the city's established theme of transformation and evolution would feel coherent in a way that a more arbitrary choice of original Pokemon would not. The theory is supported by nothing explicit in the games themselves, but it sits comfortably enough in the available space that it has become, for many players, their preferred interpretation of the origin story. The beasts roam the roots of Johto in their rebuilt forms, and the question of what they were before they burned remains open, a quiet absence at the center of one of the franchise's most iconic stories. Nobody in the Pokemon community has ever definitively resolved the question of what is beneath Diglett, and the creature has become a kind of ongoing philosophical joke about the limits of available information. The Pokedex entries for Diglett describe it as a creature that lives underground and rarely emerges, with only its small pink face and the top portion of its head visible above the soil. What exists beneath the surface, what shape the rest of its body takes, has never been depicted in any official illustration or animation. Various fan theories have proposed everything from tiny feet to enormous bodies to simply more Diglett extending downward indefinitely, and Game Freak has maintained a position of cheerful non-commitment on the subject, occasionally acknowledging the question's existence without answering it. The anime briefly suggested a particular form in one episode, but the suggestion was not consistent with other depictions and did not settle the conversation. The construction of Pokémon Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Color represents one of the more remarkable technical achievements in the early history of the franchise, and the circumstances under which that achievement was accomplished are not widely known outside of development-focused discussions. The games were designed to contain not only the new Johto region, with its 16 gym badges and its substantially expanded roster of Pokémon, but also the entire Kanto region from the original games, accessible after completing the Johto storyline. Including Kanto was a decision made late in development, and the engineering work required to fit both regions into the Game Boy Color's memory while maintaining acceptable performance was the kind of task that required genuinely creative solutions. Iwata Satoru, who would later become the president of Nintendo, reportedly contributed significant programming work to compress the game's data into the available space, and his contributions are credited with making the final scope of the games possible. Another quiet detail appears when you consider the implications of Kanto's inclusion in Gold and Silver for the history of Pokémon game design as a whole. The decision to include a second explorable region in a mainline game established an expectation among fans that has influenced how each subsequent release is received, with players sometimes expressing disappointment when a new game confines itself to a single region. The post-game content in Gold and Silver, the ability to travel to Kanto and eventually challenge the protagonist of the first games in the final battle of the second, set a standard for what a complete Pokémon experience could look like, and that standard has cast a long shadow over every generation that followed it. The achievement was partly one of engineering and partly one of design ambition, and the story of how it was accomplished is interesting enough that it deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Pokémon anime has a complicated history with continuity, and one of the clearest examples of that complication involves the character of Professor Ivy and the question of why Brock never discusses his time with her after returning to Ash's traveling party. During the Orange Islands arc, Brock decided to stay behind with Professor Ivy on Valencia Island rather than continuing his journey with Ash. When Brock reappeared in the Johto arc, he was notably different in demeanor and would become visibly distressed whenever anyone mentioned Professor Ivy's name, turning pale and muttering that he didn't want to talk about it. The reason for his distress was never revealed in the anime. The writers simply introduced the reaction as a running gag without providing an explanation, and no subsequent episode addressed what had happened during his time with her. The deliberate withholding of an explanation for Brock's reaction to Professor Ivy's name is a small but illustrative example of how the Pokémon anime handled its own continuity during the Johto era. The series was not designed to reward close attention to plot threads that ran from arc to arc, and character moments that raised questions tended to remain questions indefinitely. Brock's visible discomfort became a joke that referenced its own inexplicability, a narrative blank space that the show was content to leave blank. For a certain kind of viewer, this was genuinely unsatisfying, because the reaction implied a story that was interesting enough to be alluded to, but apparently not interesting enough to tell. The Professor Ivy mystery sits in the same category as the GS ball. Not a deliberate puzzle, but an abandoned thread, the kind of incompleteness that accrues when a long running narrative moves forward without looking back. The Space World demo, a prototype build of Pokémon Gold and Silver that was publicly demonstrated at the Nintendo Space World Trade Show in 1997, contained a roster of Pokémon designs that differed substantially from the creatures that appeared in the final released games. For years, players were aware of this demo only through photographs taken at the event and through vague references in gaming publications of the era, and the full details of what the demo contained remained uncertain. In 2018, a significant data dump from the prototype became available to researchers, and the designs it contained, many of which had never been publicly documented, generated enormous interest in the community. Among the designs were early forms of creatures that eventually became familiar Johto Pokémon, rendered in preliminary states that showed the design process at a much earlier stage than anything previously available. What the Space World demo revealed, for players interested in the history of Pokémon design, was that the creative process for Generation 2 had been considerably more ambitious in certain respects than the final games suggested. There were designs for evolutions and pre-evolutions of Generation 1 Pokémon that were cut before release, including early forms of creatures that players had speculated about for years. There were Pokémon that shared visual elements with final designs, but were clearly earlier iterations, showing the path the designs had taken before arriving at their finished forms. The demo also included designs that bore no resemblance to anything in the released games, creatures that were simply discarded entirely rather than refined into something else. The dump represented a more complete record of what Gold and Silver could have been than anything previously available, and the fan community spent months carefully documenting and discussing what it contained. Pokémon Snap, released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999 in Japan and 2000 in other regions, occupies a unique position in the franchise's history as a game that invited players to observe Pokémon in their natural habitats rather than battle or collect them. The game's premise placed players on a guided tour through various environments, armed with a camera and a limited supply of items, and the goal was to photograph Pokémon in poses and interactions that would receive high scores from Professor Oak. The game was built on a system of environmental triggers that could unlock hidden appearances and behaviors, and discovering these triggers, which required specific items thrown at specific moments in specific locations, was the primary form of depth that Snap offered players willing to explore beyond the obvious. The development of Pokémon Snap involved collaboration between Nintendo and the studio HAL Laboratory, and the constraints of the Nintendo 64 hardware shaped the game's design in visible ways. The on-rails structure of each course, in which the player rode a vehicle called the 01 through the environment rather than moving freely, was partly a response to the difficulty of rendering large, three-dimensional environments with enough detail to make the Pokémon appear convincing. By controlling the player's movement path, the designers could ensure that what was visible at any given moment was fully rendered and acceptably detailed, without needing to prepare every surface and corner of an open world for possible inspection. The resulting game had a quality of patient observation that suited its subject well, and the feeling of floating quietly through a space while creatures went about their business around the edges of awareness has a contemplative texture that the franchise has rarely reproduced. The origins of Mewtwo and the moral questions embedded in its design represent one of the more philosophically developed threads in the original games, particularly given that the games were directed at children. The Pokémon Mansion diary entries describe the scientific pursuit of Mew's genetic material and the successful cloning of a new creature from that material, and the entries show the process going wrong in ways the researchers did not anticipate. The creature that emerged from the experiment was more powerful than anything the scientists had created before, and it was also apparently aware in a way that made it dangerous. The entries end with a sequence of events that implied violence or catastrophe, and the final message that the researchers had fled and that Mewtwo had escaped the mansion was left without resolution in the game's narrative. The backstory of Mewtwo was expanded significantly by the first Pokémon film, which depicted the creature's awakening and its subsequent recruitment by Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, before its eventual rebellion and escape. The film took the questions raised by the Mansion Diary entries and constructed around them a story about the ethics of creation, the meaning of artificial life, and what it might mean for a being to come into existence as someone else's tool. These were not the kinds of themes that most games aimed at children engaged with directly, and the first Pokémon film's willingness to take them seriously contributed to its unusual cultural presence. Mewtwo, as a designed being who became aware and then became angry about the circumstances of that awareness, represented something genuinely interesting about what happens when creative tools are given more depth than strictly necessary. The connection between the Pokémon and Digimon franchises has been a recurring point of discussion ever since both properties became prominent in the late 1990s, and the conversation around that connection involves some genuinely interesting history that is separate from the question of which franchise influenced which. Digimon emerged from a product line called Digital Monster, which was itself a variation on the Tamagotchi virtual pet devices that Bandai had introduced several years earlier. The original Digital Monster devices were marketed primarily at boys as a combative alternative to the more nurturing Tamagotchi, and the concept of digital creatures that evolved and fought was developed without any direct knowledge of what Game Freak was working on. Both franchises arrived at a similar conceptual space through independent paths, which makes the question of influence considerably less interesting than the question of why this particular combination of ideas appeared in the same cultural moment. The history of Pokemon's competitive scene contains some remarkable stories about the intersection of community development and official recognition, and one thread that runs through that history is the question of what constitutes a legitimate competitive Pokemon. Because breeding for competitive statistics requires enormous investment of time, and because the random nature of inherited characteristics means that achieving the desired combination through legitimate means can take dozens or hundreds of breeding attempts. There has always existed within the competitive community a tension between players who obtain their Pokemon through conventional gameplay and those who use external tools to generate them with the desired statistics already in place. The legitimacy of this practice has been a persistent conversation with arguments on both sides that touch on questions about what competition is actually testing and whether the breeding process itself constitutes meaningful play. Another quiet detail appears when you look at some of the stranger corners of the game's early availability period, and notice how the augmented reality gameplay occasionally produced encounters that felt genuinely poetic. Players reported finding Pokemon in locations that seemed thematically appropriate in ways the game could not have arranged deliberately. Water types appearing near rivers and lakes, grass types in parks and gardens, ghost types turning up in older neighborhoods and near historical landmarks. This was an artifact of how the spawn system worked, drawing on GPS location data and the categorization of different types of terrain and infrastructure, but the result was that the game occasionally felt as if it understood something about the relationship between creature and environment that went beyond algorithm. The moments when that feeling arose were quiet and slightly uncanny, and they contributed to the game's unusual cultural presence in its first months. The sound design of the Pokémon games has received less scholarly attention than the visual design, but it contains its own depths. The music composed for the original games by Junichi Masuda established an approach to game soundtracks that has influenced the series ever since, working within the severe constraints of the Game Boy's audio hardware to create pieces that were memorable and emotionally varied despite being rendered in a format that offered very little room for complexity. The Route 1 theme, the Pallet Town music, the gym battle track, these are pieces that adults who played the games as children can recall in detail decades later, and the durability of that recall speaks to how effectively the compositions lodge themselves in memory. The constraints of the hardware contributed to this in ways that sound paradoxical, because the music could not rely on rich instrumentation or complex arrangement. It had to accomplish its work through melodic distinctiveness and emotional directness, and those qualities made it more persistently memorable than a more sophisticated treatment might have been. The development of the music for Lavender Town involved choices that were slightly different from the rest of the game's soundtrack, and those differences help explain why the music functions as well as it does at establishing its particular atmosphere. Where most of the game's tracks were designed to be energizing or at minimum neutral in emotional valence, the Lavender Town music was deliberately constructed to feel unsettling. The piece uses a limited harmonic vocabulary in ways that avoid the major key resolutions that the rest of the game's music tends toward, and the repetition of its primary motif creates a quality of circling restlessness rather than the forward momentum of battle or exploration music. These were deliberate compositional choices made in service of the location's identity as a place of mourning and spiritual unease, and they succeeded so well that the music became inseparable from the mythology that grew up around Lavender Town over the following decades. The question of how Pokémon eggs work has occupied a notable amount of community discussion over the years, mostly because the game's explanation of the process is both deliberately vague and somewhat implausible in the ways it glosses over the mechanics of reproduction for creatures with radically different biologies. The game offers the fiction that eggs are found by Pokémon rather than produced, a narrative convention that allows the breeding mechanic to exist without requiring the games to depict anything more explicit than a Pokémon discovering a mysterious egg that appeared while two compatible creatures were left at a daycare. This explanation is transparently a polite fiction, and the community has always been aware of this, but the acceptance of the fiction is also a small example of how the franchise handles the gap between the world it depicts and the processes that would have to exist in that world if taken literally. The fifth generation games, Pokémon Black and White, represented a deliberate artistic statement on the part of Game Freak that was unusual enough to generate significant discussion when the games were released in Japan in 2010. The decision to withhold all information about the new region's Pokémon roster until after release, to limit pre-release marketing to a narrow set of new creatures, and to construct a narrative that directly addressed themes of idealism and pragmatism through its main villains, represented a more self-conscious approach to what a Pokémon game could be than the franchise had typically displayed. The story of Team Plasma and its leader N involved a genuine philosophical argument about the nature of the relationship between humans and Pokémon, and the game took that argument seriously enough to present both sides with clarity before allowing the player to decide through action which position the narrative endorsed. N's character, in particular, represented something new for a Pokémon villain in that his motivations were not simply cruel or acquisitive, but grounded in a coherent, if incomplete, worldview about the suffering that the Pokémon-trainer relationship might cause to the creatures involved. His backstory revealed that he had been raised in isolation from humans and in close proximity to Pokémon who were being mistreated, an upbringing that produced his genuine compassion for Pokémon alongside his inability to understand the way that humans and Pokémon could form bonds based on something other than control. The design of N as a character who was wrong in his conclusions, but not in his concerns, was sophisticated enough to affect players in ways that the more straightforwardly antagonistic villains of previous games had not, and the community's response to him over the years since the game's release has been notable for how persistently affectionate it has been. Metagross is described as having a brain formed from the fusion of four linked nervous systems, creating a computational capacity that exceeds that of a supercomputer. Alakazam is described as having an IQ that grows continuously and a memory that is perfect and total. Gardevoir is described as capable of predicting the future and generating a small black hole to protect the trainer it has bonded with. These descriptions place certain Pokemon in categories that are difficult to reconcile with the framing of the game, which is that they are creatures kept in small, spherical containers and brought out when their trainers need them for competition. The gap between the described capabilities of some Pokemon and the circumstances they inhabit is one of the persistent, strange textures of the series, a gap that the games generally prefer not to examine too directly. The Pokemon that are described as having human-like or superhuman intelligence are particularly interesting in this context because their participation in the trainer system implies a voluntary element that is not present in creatures who are simply following instinct. A creature with superhuman intelligence who participates in Pokemon battles is making a choice to do so in a way that a creature operating on instinct is not. The implications of that distinction are not things the games address, but they linger in the background of any encounter with a creature described as dramatically more intelligent than the humans who direct it. There are aspects of the Pokemon world that become strange when examined through the framework of ordinary ecology, things that the games present as normal features of their world that would in an actual ecosystem raise significant questions. The experience point system, through which Pokemon gain in strength and capability after defeating other creatures in battle, implies something about the energetics of the Pokemon world that does not quite fit ordinary biological frameworks. In biology, energy flows from food, and strength is built through rest and nutrition. In the Pokemon world, the act of defeating opponents appears to be directly nutritive in some sense, converting combat into capability in a way that has no obvious physical mechanism. The healing centers that appear in every town and city, providing complete restoration of health and energy at no cost to the player, imply a medical infrastructure that would be extraordinary even by the standards of advanced human medicine. The healing is immediate and complete. No explanation for how it works is ever offered. The Chansey and Blissey who assist at these centers are described as having healing properties, but the specific mechanism by which a completely depleted party is restored to full health in moments is simply one of the things the world does not explain. These gaps between the world's described properties and the physical logic that would be required to produce them are part of the texture of playing in a world that is built from imagination rather than simulation. The games make these accommodations for the player experience rather than for physical plausibility, and that is entirely appropriate for what they are. But noticing the gaps is part of how the world reveals its own construction. The animated Pokémon series engaged with the question of what Mewtwo was and what its existence meant in ways that the games handled differently, and the treatment in the first Pokémon film remains one of the most discussed pieces of the extended Pokémon universe. Mewtwo Strikes Back presented a creature that was aware of its own origin, aware that it had been created rather than born, and that had developed a response to that knowledge that began with rage and moved towards something more complicated. The film's central question is whether a creature defined by what it was made from can escape that definition, whether origin is destiny or simply a starting point. The resolution of the film has been discussed extensively for the way it handled its own premise. Mewtwo's conclusion that the circumstances of one's creation do not determine the value of one's life is a genuinely philosophical position arrived at through a genuinely difficult process within the narrative, and the film presents it with a seriousness that was unusual for the context in which it appeared. The different versions of the film that were released in different regions sometimes told the story differently, with the English localization altering or removing certain dialogue that was present in the original Japanese version. These differences affected how Mewtwo's journey was framed and what the film's conclusion was understood to mean, making different audiences' experience of the same story actually quite different at the level of theme and implication. The Pokemon world has always contained things that are presented as fictional within its own mythology, legends, and stories that characters in the world describe as legend, whose literal truth is then confirmed or complicated by the events of the games. The legendary Pokemon of the Alola region exist within a Hawaiian-influenced mythological tradition that the games represent with considerable care. The Tapus, the guardian deities of the Four Islands, are described in terms that draw from the actual traditions of indigenous Hawaiian culture, adapted into the framework of the Pokemon world. The games engage with these traditions through the lens of appreciation, through the character of Tapu Koko and its companions, and the role they play in the Alola region's ecology and culture. The treatment of real cultural traditions within the Pokemon world is an area where the series has been more or less successful at different moments. When the adaptation is done with attention and care, taking the spirit of a tradition and using it to build something new, the result enriches the Pokemon world by connecting it to the depth of human cultural history. When it is done less carefully, the result can feel like borrowing that does not fully honor what it is using. The Alola region's engagement with Hawaiian culture is generally considered among the more thoughtful examples of this kind of adaptation within the series, creating a region with a distinctive and consistent cultural texture that extends from the legendary Pokemon through the visual design of the environments and into the way human characters describe their relationship to the land and the creatures they share it with. The community that has grown around the Pokemon franchise has developed its own traditions and practices that exist apart from anything the games themselves contain. Practices that are recognized by experienced players in the way that any specialized community recognizes its own conventions. The practice of Nuzlocke challenges involves playing a Pokemon game under a specific set of self-imposed rules. In its basic form, a Nuzlocke requires that if a Pokemon faints in battle, it is considered dead and must be permanently retired, and that only the first Pokemon encountered on each new route may be captured. These rules transform a game that is normally quite forgiving, where defeat is merely a setback and every creature can be healed to full health, into something with genuine stakes, where loss is permanent and decisions carry real consequences. The Nuzlocke challenge originated from a webcomic drawn by a player who set these rules for himself and then documented the experience in comic form. The format spread through the community and generated an enormous body of similar documentation, written and visual accounts of players attempting the challenge with varying degrees of success. The format spread further into other games beyond Pokemon, and additional variants were developed that added new restrictions or modified the existing ones. What the Nuzlocke challenge reveals is something about the community's desire for the games to mean more than they do by default, to have the stakes of the adventure match the emotional investment that players bring to it. The games themselves are designed to be completable by most players who engage with them seriously. The Nuzlocke challenge removes that safety net, and in doing so, changes the experience into something that can generate genuine attachment and genuine grief when creatures are lost. There are Pokemon whose designs contain historical or scientific references that are not immediately visible, but that become interesting once noticed. Relicanth is designed after the coelacanth, a species of fish long believed to be extinct that was discovered alive in deep ocean waters in the 1930s. The coelacanth had a fossil record suggesting it had existed for hundreds of millions of years with very little change, and its discovery alive was one of the more remarkable events in 20th century biology, a creature from deep time suddenly present in the contemporary world. Relicanth's Pokedex entries describe it as a Pokemon that has existed unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, a living fossil found in the deepest parts of the ocean, adapting the real Coelacanth story into the Pokemon world with some fidelity to the source. Aerodactyl draws from the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic era, but its design incorporates elements that distinguish it from a literal pterosaur reconstruction, emphasizing the teeth, the wing membrane, and a ferocity that the fossil record only partially supports. The Pokemon world's relationship to paleontology across the fossil Pokemon that appear in various games is an interesting thread to follow, showing how the games have adapted real, prehistoric creatures into the specific visual and mechanical vocabulary of the series. The fossil revival mechanic itself carries a small piece of scientific history within it. The idea of recovering genetic information from ancient preserved material and using it to recreate extinct organisms was a subject of genuine scientific discussion in the early 1990s, around the time the Pokemon games were being developed. The fossil Pokemon were not designed in a vacuum. The ending that the original series writer, Takeshi Shudo, envisioned for the Pokemon anime has become one of the more discussed pieces of the franchise's extended mythology, partly because of how different it is from what the actual series provided, and partly because of what it suggests about the story's possible meaning. Shudo's planned ending described a Pokemon rebellion, a moment at which the creatures who had coexisted with humans would recognize the nature of their situation and respond to it. Pikachu was imagined as the leader of this uprising, the most famous face of the partnership between humans and Pokemon becoming the symbol of its end. Team Rocket's Meowth, able to communicate between the two species, would attempt to mediate and fail to do so effectively. The rebellion, as Shudo imagined it, was not simply a conflict, but a revelation, a moment at which the fundamental relationship between humans and Pokemon would be exposed as something more complicated than the partnership the series had depicted. The implication was that what had looked like friendship might have been something else, that the cheerful world of badges and tournaments had been built on a foundation that, once examined directly, could not sustain itself. Shudo died before the series reached any ending, and the actual animated series eventually concluded Ash's journey in a way that honored the friendship at the core of the story without reaching the darker territory he had imagined. But the existence of his planned ending gives the series a shadow, a version of itself that could have existed and that, once known, makes certain aspects of the actual series feel different to consider. The question of who created Arceus, the Pokemon described as the creator of the Pokemon world, is one that the games raise without resolving, and that has generated significant discussion within the community. Arceus is described as the being that existed before the universe, that shaped the world from chaos, that created the legendaries who govern time and space and antimatter. The mythology of Arceus is built from creation narrative conventions that appear across many religious traditions, the idea of a supreme being who precedes everything and is the source of everything that follows. In the context of the Pokemon world, this mythology is presented with a seriousness that the games usually reserve for their most significant moments. But the question of what preceded Arceus, what the state of the universe was before Arceus existed and created itself, is a question that the games gesture toward without answering. The entries describe Arceus as hatching from an egg, which implies a moment before the egg existed, which implies something that the creation mythology does not quite account for. This is not a unique challenge for creation mythology, which generally cannot avoid the question of what preceded the creator, but it is interesting to find it present in this particular context. The Pokemon universe's mythology extends beyond Arceus into structures that imply multiple dimensions, multiple versions of the world, and the possibility of travel between them. The games that have explored these concepts most directly, including the Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and the stories involving the Ultra Beasts in Sun and Moon, suggest a cosmology considerably more complex than any single game's storyline makes explicit. The creatures called Ultra Beasts, introduced in Pokémon Sun and Moon, represent a genuinely distinctive moment in the series, a set of Pokémon whose visual design and narrative framing deliberately set them apart from everything that came before. The Ultra Beasts are described as originating from a different dimension, accessed through the wormholes that appear in the sky above the Alola region. Their designs follow rules that feel different from the rules that govern other Pokémon, more elongated, more geometric in unexpected places, more insistently wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely, but that are immediately noticeable. The effect is of creatures that were designed by someone who understood what Pokémon look like, and then made deliberate choices not to follow those conventions. The reception of the Ultra Beasts within the community was divided along lines that tracked fairly closely with how different players relate to the series. Players who valued the ecological and naturalistic aspects of the Pokémon world found them difficult to accept as Pokémon in any meaningful sense. Players who appreciated the series for its willingness to include genuinely strange designs found them to be among the more interesting additions in recent memory. The Ultra Beasts made explicit something that had always been implicit in the Pokémon world's relationship to strangeness, that the category of Pokémon is wide enough to include things that feel deeply alien rather than familiar, things that do not draw on the same visual vocabularies as most of the series, but that occupy the same mechanical role. The question of where the category ends is one the Ultra Beasts push against in ways that creatures like Garchomp or Hydreigon, however strange their designs, do not. The Pokémon games have been played on hardware that they were not designed for, modified in ways that their creators did not intend, and used as platforms for creative projects that range from personal expression to extended artistic statements. The existence of deleted or altered content in Generation 5 extends beyond characterization into the game's data, where researchers have found evidence of features and designs that were cut before the final release. The most significant of these involves a small number of Pokémon designs that appear in the game's code in incomplete states, suggesting creatures that were in development but not finished or not approved before the games shipped. These designs have generated the same kind of careful analysis that the Space World demo produced for Generation 2, with researchers attempting to reconstruct from partial data what the complete versions of these creatures might have looked like. The designs that can be partially recovered tend to confirm the general design sensibilities visible in the finished game, suggesting that the cuts were made relatively late in development, rather than representing radical early-stage experiments. The Pokémon franchise has an unusual relationship with the concept of death that becomes visible if you examine the game's and anime's handling of it carefully. In the main series games, fainting in battle results in a Pokémon losing consciousness temporarily rather than dying, and the Pokémon Center mechanic provides full recovery with no lasting harm. The game's framing explicitly avoids the language of death, preferring the notion that a Pokémon that has lost in battle has simply run out of fighting energy and needs rest. This framing is so thorough and so consistently maintained that it has become part of how players think about the game world, and the moments where the franchise gestures toward the actual reality of death feel disproportionately significant by contrast. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, the cemetery for deceased Pokémon, carries emotional weight precisely because it acknowledges something the rest of the game is careful not to. The anime has a more complicated history with the concept than the games do. The farewell of Ash's Butterfree, which was not depicted as death but as a departure, still produced one of the most emotionally affecting moments in the series' early run because the nature of the departure carried all the weight of a permanent loss. The first Pokémon film's extended sequence in which Mewtwo's clone army battles the original Pokémon, resulting in Ash being turned to stone, was depicted with a gravity that felt entirely at odds with the franchise's usual approach to consequences. These moments stood out because they broke from the established convention of safety and reversibility that most of the franchise maintained, and the breaking of that convention is what made them memorable. Generation 4 introduced a set of Pokémon, the Lake Guardians, and the Creation Trio, that carried mythological implications larger than anything the franchise had previously attempted to codify. Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina were described in terms that positioned them as the embodiment of time, space, and antimatter respectively, and the games placed them in a cosmological framework that made the Pokemon world feel less like a game setting and more like a designed cosmology with genuine internal structure. The idea that the world of Pokemon had a god, Arceus, who had hatched from an egg at the beginning of existence and had used 1,000 arms to create the universe before separating it into its component elements, was not a detail that players could encounter in normal gameplay, but was embedded in the lore in ways that rewarded close reading of Pokédex entries and in-game texts. The Distortion World, the alternate dimension that served as Giratina's domain and as the setting for a significant portion of Pokémon Platinum's story, represented a design achievement that is sometimes underappreciated. The environment was constructed around the premise of a space in which ordinary physical laws did not apply, and the designers translated this idea into gameplay by creating areas where the player could walk on walls and ceilings, where gravity changed depending on the surface being traversed, and where the visual design evoked a space that was recognizably structured, but profoundly wrong in its orientation. The Distortion World was the most visually unusual environment the franchise had produced to that point, and the willingness to commit to its internal logic throughout the section of the game that took place that gave it a quality of genuine otherworldliness that the franchise's more conventional environments rarely achieve. The story of Game Freak's origins as a company illuminates certain aspects of the Pokémon franchise that might otherwise seem arbitrary. Game Freak began as a fanzine about video games, produced by a group of enthusiasts, including Satoshi Tajiri, before evolving into a game development studio. Tajiri's childhood interest in collecting insects, spending hours in the fields and streams near his home searching for specimens, became a conceptual foundation for the creature collecting mechanics that would define the franchise he later created. The connection between the physical experience of searching the natural world for hidden living things and the digital experience of exploring tall grass and caves in search of wild Pokémon was not incidental but direct, a translation of a childhood practice into a medium that could preserve its essential feeling while making it accessible to children who might never have access to the wild spaces that Tajiri had known. Another quiet detail appears when you consider how the specific quality of Tajiri's childhood experience shaped not just the broad concept of Pokémon, but some of its particular details. The importance of location in determining which Pokémon could be found, the way certain creatures appeared only in specific environments or only at particular times of day, the sense that a complete collection required exploring diverse habitats rather than grinding a single location. All of these design decisions reflected the logic of actual natural history collecting, where knowledge of habitat and behavior was as important as the ability to catch. This fidelity to the experiential logic of the activity it was modeling gave Pokémon a depth that games based on more abstract collection mechanics tended to lack, and it contributed significantly to the franchise's durability across decades and generations of players. The trading mechanic that was fundamental to the original game's design, requiring players to connect with other people using the Game Boy Link cable to complete their Pokémon collections, was partly a practical decision arising from hardware limitations. The decision to restrict certain Pokémon to specific version releases and to make others unobtainable without trading was not simply a marketing strategy designed to sell two versions of the same game, though it served that purpose. It was also a design decision that encoded a social dynamic into the gameplay. To complete the collection, you needed to know other people to have conversations, to engage in exchanges. The Pokédex completion message, seen by only the most dedicated players, arrived at the end of a journey that required not just personal effort, but social connection, and this quality made the completion feel different from achievements that could be obtained through solo effort alone. The anime's treatment of Pokemon aging and evolution produced some storylines that, examined after the fact, raised questions that the series was not prepared to address directly. When Ash's Charizard disobeyed him during the early gym battle period, the narrative framing was that Charizard had evolved and become powerful enough to question why it should continue to follow someone who had not proven his worth. This was presented as a character conflict between Ash and Charizard, but the underlying premise involved a Pokemon making a reasoned assessment of a relationship and deciding that the terms of that relationship were not satisfactory. The eventual resolution involved Ash demonstrating dedication and care, intense enough to earn Charizard's respect. But the story's existence at all acknowledged something that the franchise generally preferred to leave implicit: that the relationship between trainer and Pokemon was a genuine relationship that had to be maintained through effort and could be damaged by neglect or failure. The mechanics of shininess, the variant coloring that gives certain Pokemon a different visual appearance, were introduced in Generation 2 and have been a persistent aspect of the franchise's collectible dimension ever since. In the original implementation, the odds of encountering a shiny Pokemon through normal gameplay were approximately 1 in 8,192, odds so unlikely that many players who spent hundreds of hours with the games never encountered a shiny in the wild at all. The rarity was not arbitrary, but arose from how the game calculated a Pokemon's individual values, the hidden numbers that determined its statistical potential, with shininess triggered by a specific combination of those values. Subsequent generations have modified these odds through various means, both reducing them through explicit game mechanics and providing methods for targeted shiny hunting that the earlier games' designs had not anticipated. The cultural weight that shininess acquired within the Pokemon community is disproportionate to its actual effect on gameplay, because a shiny Pokemon has the same statistical potential as a standard colored one and no competitive advantage at all. The value is entirely aesthetic and social, derived from rarity and from the visible marker that the alternate coloring provides of the significant time investment required to obtain it. This dynamic is interesting because it demonstrates that a feature with no functional value can acquire enormous importance within a community that has decided collectively to treat it as significant. The shiny system is, in its own small way, a study in how value emerges from consensus rather than from inherent properties, and the lengths to which players go to obtain specific shinies, sometimes spending hundreds of hours at a single encounter point, reflect how thoroughly the community has internalized the cultural meaning of the coloring. Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced breeding, which allowed players to leave two compatible Pokemon at the daycare and eventually receive an egg containing a new Pokemon of the same species as the mother. The full depth of the breeding system was not made explicit by the games themselves, and many players spent years using the daycare without understanding the implications of the inherited value system it contained. The breeding mechanic was designed to allow players to obtain Pokemon with specific desirable statistical profiles, but doing this systematically required understanding a set of invisible numbers and how they combined information that the game never provided directly and that the player community had to reverse engineer through experimentation and analysis. The gap between what the game told players about breeding and what could actually be done with a full understanding of its mechanics was large enough to support an entire subculture of competitive preparation that remained largely invisible to casual players. The ghost type was introduced in Generation 1 with only 3 Pokemon belonging to it: Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. The type's interactions with the Pokemon's other types and with the Psychic type created an interesting situation in the original game's type chart. Ghost type moves were supposed to be effective against Psychic type Pokemon, which would have made Ghost types a useful counter to the otherwise dominant Psychic type in Generation 1. However, a programming error resulted in Ghost type moves having no effect on Psychic types instead of super effective damage. And since the only Ghost type moves in the original games were normal and poison type moves presented as ghost attacks with no actual typing that would trigger the effectiveness, the entire design relationship between Ghost and Psychic was effectively broken. The Ghost type Pokemon, which should have been the natural predators of the dominant Psychic types, were instead largely useless against them, and the oversight was not corrected until later generations. The Psychic type's dominance in Generation 1 is a well-documented feature of the game's competitive landscape, but the extent of that dominance is sometimes underappreciated. Psychic was effectively weak to only one type, Bug, and the Bug type moves available in the game were so weak that they posed no genuine threat to any competent Psychic type. This left the type essentially uncountered, and the result was that a small number of Psychic-type Pokemon, particularly Alakazam, Starmie, and Slowbro, occupied a tier of competitive viability so far above everything else in the game that tournaments of the era were shaped almost entirely around them. The Pokemon that could contest with those creatures and the strategies designed to handle them defined the competitive meta of the period in ways that subsequent type chart revisions would make impossible to reproduce. The Pokémon Company's relationship with fan-made games and other fan-creative works has been complex and at times contentious. For many years, unofficial fan games using Pokémon characters and settings circulated freely in the community, and the company took a generally permissive attitude toward these projects as long as they were not sold commercially. However, there have been notable instances where cease and desist actions were taken against specific fan projects, and the uncertainty about when such action might be taken has cast a persistent shadow over the development of ambitious fan games. Some of the most technically impressive Pokémon fan games have been stopped shortly before or after their release, and the community's responses to these situations have been complex, combining disappointment with acknowledgement of the legal realities that govern the company's decisions. The fan game tradition within Pokémon represents one of the most active and technically accomplished areas of franchise-adjacent creativity in gaming, and its relationship with official property has never been entirely settled. ROM hacking, the practice of modifying the data of existing Pokémon games to create new experiences, has produced some remarkable projects that have shaped the community in ways that are not always visible from outside. The most elaborate ROM hacks function essentially as complete new games, with original stories, redesigned regions, custom Pokémon movesets and appearances, and difficulty curves adjusted to challenge experienced players in ways that the original games were not designed to do. Some of these hacks have been played by more people than many commercially released games and have generated communities of their own, with players discussing their strategies and discoveries in the same ways that players discuss official releases. The existence of ROM hacking as a creative practice demonstrates how fully players can engage with the underlying systems of the games when given access to them, and the most successful hacks show how much the franchise's core mechanics can support varied and challenging experiences when the surrounding structure is reconsidered. The question of the Pokémon world's relationship to our world has been addressed in different ways by different parts of the franchise. The anime has historically maintained that the Pokémon world is simply our world, but with Pokémon in it, with references to real-world geography, historical events, and cultural practices occasionally appearing in dialogue and settings. The games have been somewhat more careful about this, establishing fictional regions with Japanese-inspired or European-inspired geography rather than naming real-world locations. Some players have attempted to map the Pokemon world's geography onto that of the real world, with various regions corresponding to specific parts of Japan or other locations, and the franchise has occasionally acknowledged these parallels in official materials. The relationship between the fictional world and our world is deliberately kept loose enough to accommodate multiple interpretations, and the iceberg contains many layers of speculation about what the implications of a closer mapping would be. The concept of Professor Oak as an unreliable presence in the original games has been a thread in fan discussion since at least the mid-2000 period. The observation that Oak does not know what his own grandson's name is when asking the player to enter it at the start of the game, despite the fact that the game presents this as a genuine information-gathering exercise rather than a naming convention, became a persistent source of gentle humor. But extended beyond the joke, the question of what Oak knows and does not know about the world of the games contains some genuinely interesting implications. The Pokédex, which Oak provides to the player with the instruction to complete it, is presented as a scientific instrument designed to record information about all Pokémon. But the Pokédex entries themselves, filled as they are with information that could not have been gathered through standard observation, raise questions about how the data was originally compiled and who conducted the research that produced it. The environmental detail in the Pokémon games, the objects and furniture and bookshelves and decorations that fill the interiors of homes and buildings, has been a source of discoveries for players who read everything in the game world. The bookcases in homes and libraries contain readable text that occasionally touches on the history of the region or on philosophical questions about the nature of the Pokémon world. Certain pieces of furniture, when examined, produce commentary from the player character that reveals information about their age, interests, and state of mind that the game's narrative never directly addresses. The world of the games is populated with this kind of readable, incidental detail, and the cumulative effect of reading all of it is a picture of the franchise's world that is richer and more internally consistent than the main story typically makes visible. The Safari Zone, introduced in the original games as a special reserve where rare Pokémon could be found using a different catching mechanic than the rest of the game, established a design tradition that has appeared in various forms across multiple generations. The mechanic, which prevented the use of one's own Pokémon and replaced standard combat with a system of baiting and throwing special balls, was frustrating in ways that some players found charming and others found simply irritating. The underlying design premise was that the Safari Zone was a protected area where wild Pokémon could not be battled in the usual sense, a premise that has some interesting implications for how catching Pokémon is framed elsewhere in the game. If there are places where battling wild Pokémon to weaken them before capture is considered inappropriate, the mechanics of catching in the rest of the game carry a somewhat different character. Another quiet detail appears when you think about how different generations have handled the concept of legendary Pokémon and the implications of their availability within the games. A legendary Pokémon, by conventional definition, is a creature of which only one exists in the world, a unique being rather than a species. But the games allow players to trade these creatures to other games, and multiple players can possess the same legendary. The game world's internal logic is strained by this in ways that the narrative does not address, because the story presents each legendary as singular and irreplaceable, while the game mechanics allow duplication and distribution. Some fans have proposed that the story happens in a unique instance of the game world, while the trading features connect that world to other instances, a solution that introduces its own complications. The franchise has generally chosen to not address this tension explicitly, leaving each player's relationship to the legendary in their collection as a personal mythology rather than a shared canonical fact. The Pokémon card game, which launched alongside the video games and became briefly more culturally visible than them during the late 1990s, contains its own history of rare and unusual cards that has generated dedicated collector communities. The holographic cards from the Basa set, the first English release, are among the most recognizable artifacts of the franchise's initial cultural moment, and the prices they command in contemporary collector markets reflect both their nostalgic significance and the relative scarcity of examples that have survived decades in good condition. The card game also went through a period of genuine competitive development, with tournament scenes forming around the game's mechanics and players developing strategic frameworks for its play that were sophisticated enough to reward sustained study. The history of card rarities in the Pokémon card game contains some interesting stories about how particular cards acquired unusual values. The first edition stamp on base set cards marked them as belonging to the initial print run, and the difference in value between first edition and unlimited print versions of the same card created an interesting market dynamic where the physical appearance of an otherwise identical object carried significant monetary weight. The Charizard card from base set became the most famous example of this, with first edition holographic copies eventually selling at prices that would have been difficult to predict from the game's earliest months. The Charizard's competitive irrelevance in the card game itself, which became apparent relatively quickly as more powerful cards were released, did not diminish its status as a collectible, because the value had long since detached from gameplay utility and anchored instead to the emotional weight of the object as a childhood artifact. The development of Pokémon's third generation for the Game Boy Advance involved a decision that surprised and divided the community at the time. The new games, Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, were not designed to be compatible with the existing Generation 1 and 2 save data, meaning that Pokémon from the previous games could not be transferred to the new ones. This break in continuity was the most significant discontinuity the franchise had produced, and some players who had invested years in building their Generation 2 collections experienced it as a genuine loss. The decision was made partly because the Game Boy Advance's hardware could not straightforwardly communicate with the Game Boy Color hardware, and partly because the new game's design required a fresh start to introduce its mechanics properly. The later development of the PAL Park transfer feature in Generation 4 and the subsequent development of more robust transfer systems represented a partial answer to the community's desire for continuity across generations, but the gap between 2 and 3 remained permanently unbridgeable. The Hoenn region, designed for Ruby and Sapphire, was notable for the amount of its surface area covered by water, a design choice that reflected the tropical, oceanic character that the designers wanted to give the region. The water routes that occupied substantial portions of the maps were sometimes criticized for requiring extended surfing travel through encounters with a limited variety of aquatic Pokémon, a critique that acknowledged the tension between designing an oceanically authentic region and providing the gameplay variety that players expected. The design of the water routes also reflected the Pokémon roster choices for the region, which included a very large proportion of water-type creatures, a distribution that later surveys of the complete roster sometimes cited as an imbalance in the generation's design. But the Hoenn Ocean, considered as an environment with its own character rather than as a series of gameplay challenges, had a quality of expansiveness that the more land-bound regions of the franchise had not previously achieved. The music of Generation 3, composed by Masuda with contributions from other composers at Game Freak, is widely regarded within the community as among the strongest soundtracks the franchise has produced, and certain pieces from it have acquired something close to iconic status. The Route 110 theme, with its sense of open roads and possibility, the Pokémon Center theme that underscored the feeling of rest and safety in the middle of a journey, and the legendary battle themes that accompanied encounters with Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza all contributed to the generation's distinct emotional texture. The transition from the Game Boy Color's audio capabilities to the Game Boy Advance's more advanced sound hardware allowed composers to work with more complex and varied instrumentation than the earlier games had permitted, and the resulting soundtracks took full advantage of the expanded sonic palette. The phenomenon of Pokemon creepypasta, the genre of horror-adjacent fan fiction that uses the franchise's familiar elements as raw material for unsettling stories, has produced some texts that are interesting less as horror stories and more as documents of how deeply the franchise has embedded itself in the emotional lives of its players. The genre's enduring popularity reflects the fact that the Pokemon world, precisely because it is designed to feel safe and comforting, is unusually susceptible to the kind of contamination that horror works by introducing. A world where everything is familiar and reliable becomes a far more effective setting for dread than one that is already strange, because the violation of a trusted environment produces a quality of unease that novelty cannot match. The best Pokemon creepypasta understands this and uses it with some precision, deploying familiar elements in slightly wrong configurations to produce effects that purely original horror fiction cannot achieve through the same methods. The Stanford University study on Pokémon and the human brain, which received considerable attention when it was published, found evidence that people who played Pokémon extensively as children had developed a distinct region in the visual cortex that was specifically responsive to Pokémon characters. The study's findings suggested that the visual cortex, during a particular developmental window in childhood, formed neural regions specialized for the recognition of visual categories encountered frequently and consistently, and that Pokémon, encountered through the games and other media during this period, had become one of those categories for millions of people who had grown up with the franchise. The region identified by the study occupied a specific area in the visual cortex associated with the recognition of objects seen frequently at a particular visual angle and scale, conditions that matched how Pokémon characters were typically presented in the games. The implications of the Stanford study extend beyond the immediately interesting fact of a Pokémon-specific brain region to suggest something about how formative experiences with media shape cognitive architecture in ways that persist into adulthood. The visual cortex region, formed in response to Pokémon exposure, does not shrink or repurpose itself as the person matures and encounters different visual content. It remains a permanent record of a childhood engagement, woven into the neurology of adults who may not have thought about the franchise in years. This finding positions early Pokémon play not just as entertainment or cultural experience, but as a developmental event, something that happened during a window of neural plasticity and left a mark in the structure of the brain itself. The franchise's emotional resonance for the adults who grew up with it may be partly rooted in this literal physical inscription of its characters into the architecture of visual cognition. The music from the battle with Red at the summit of Mint Silver in Pokémon Gold and Silver is one of the few pieces of video game music that has been genuinely analyzed for what it accomplishes emotionally, rather than simply praised for being effective. The encounter with Red, who does not speak and whose presence is conveyed entirely through the music and through the player's knowledge of who he is, works because of the combination of visual plainness and musical intensity. Red stands on the mountain in silence, and the music that begins when the battle starts carries more weight than the dialogue of any villain in the franchise because it arrives without words, asking the player to supply the meaning themselves. The piece builds from a quiet opening into something more demanding, and the escalation matches the emotional experience of the encounter. The realization of who you are fighting, the weight of what winning would mean, the knowledge that you have arrived at the end of something significant. Another quiet detail appears when you consider the significance of Red's silence as a narrative device, and notice how much it accomplishes by refusing to do what Pokémon games normally do. Every other significant character in Gold and Silver speaks at length. The gym leaders, the Pokemon professors, the members of Team Rocket, all of them explain themselves and their motivations in ways that the franchise has consistently used to communicate story. Red says nothing, not because the writers had nothing to say, but because the choice to say nothing communicated something that words could not have matched. Red's silence was, in that sense, the most eloquent thing in the game, a deliberate absence that the player filled with the entire weight of the preceding generation. The history of Pokemon's film series contains several moments of genuine artistic ambition that received less attention than they deserved, partly because the films were marketed primarily at children and were not seriously reviewed by the critical establishment that might have recognized what some of them were attempting. The third film, Pokémon, Spell of the Unknown, which paired a story about a grieving child's relationship with her missing father with the cosmic implications of wish-granting crystal Pokémon, touched on questions about loss and the dangers of granting an incomplete wish that were affecting for adult viewers in ways the promotional materials did not prepare audiences to expect. The fourth film, which eventually brought Celebi into the story that the GS Ball had hinted toward, contained a time travel narrative that was more structurally complicated than most Pokemon films attempted, and its emotional core centered on the question of whether a lost friend could be recovered across the boundary of time, earned a genuine response from players who had grown up with the franchise. The Pokemon breeding of Marill deserves particular mention in discussions of how the franchise handled new additions to the roster, because Marill's introduction to the franchise preceded the release of the games in which it officially appeared by several years. The creature was shown in the film Mewtwo Strikes Back, released in 1998, under the name Picablu, a name that the games never used, but that the playground mythology of the era assigned to it with complete conviction. The presence of Marill in the film before Gold and Silver were released in international markets meant that English-speaking players encountered the creature in a context that provided no information about its actual name or how to obtain it, which created exactly the conditions for rumors to proliferate. Children who saw the film knew that a new Pokemon existed that was not available in their current games, and the combination of that knowledge with the general uncertainty about Generation 2 created a period of intense speculation that resolved only when the games actually became available. The animated special produced for the franchise's 20th anniversary in 2016, Pokémon Origins, represented something different from the ongoing anime series in that it was designed as a condensed retelling of the events of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the remakes of the original games. The special followed Red rather than Ash, and it was notably more willing to engage with the emotional dimensions of the Pokemon trainer relationship than the main series had typically been. The depiction of Red's initial encounter with Gengar, the sequence in which Red attempts to care for a Charmander whose trainer had abandoned it, and the final battle with Giovanni all carried a weight that the main series had rarely achieved, partly because the special's condensed format forced it to earn emotional effects quickly rather than building toward them over hundreds of episodes. The special was received enthusiastically by the segment of the community that had grown up with the original games and appreciated an adaptation that took their attachment seriously. The phenomenon of Nuzlocke challenges represents one of the most creative pieces of community-generated content in the franchise's history, in that it fundamentally altered the emotional experience of playing existing games without requiring any modification of their code. A Nuzlocke challenge imposes two primary rules on the player. Any Pokemon that faints during battle is considered permanently unavailable and must be released or boxed permanently, and the player may only attempt to catch the first Pokemon encountered in each new area, regardless of what that Pokemon is. The combination of these rules transforms a game designed to be safe and forgiving into something that carries genuine stakes, because the permanent loss of a Pokemon to which the player has become attached through hours of shared adventure produces an emotional response that the standard game design never manages. Players who have completed Nuzlocke runs consistently describe the experience as more emotionally intense than standard play, and the genre has given rise to elaborate illustrated series, video series, and written accounts that treat the procedurally generated stories of each run as genuine narratives worth telling. The existence of Nuzlocke as a community phenomenon is interesting precisely because it demonstrates that the emotional potential embedded in the franchise's design is not fully realized by the game's standard rules. The Pokemon games are designed to be completable by players who are not interested in engaging with the emotional dimensions of the trainer-Pokemon relationship, and the mechanics of recovery and continuity ensure that attachment is never truly tested by unavoidable consequences. The Nuzlocke rules remove that safety net and discover beneath it a completely different kind of game, one in which the procedurally generated companions and their random adventures and sudden tragic ends produce stories that the official games never do. The rules were invented by one person and spread through community sharing, and the fact that they transformed the games so completely is a testament to how much emotional weight the original design was carrying without discharging. The relationship between Pokemon and mortality is one of those threads in the franchise's lore that once you start pulling on it, produces an unexpected amount of material. The Pokédex entries for Ghost-type Pokémon routinely describe behaviors and origins that involve the afterlife in ways that the game's cheerful framing renders almost invisible until examined directly. Honor's entry in multiple games describes it as a creature that feeds on the life energy of humans who touch it. Gengar is described as a creature that delights in lowering the temperature of rooms. Yamask's entry in Pokemon Black describes it as a human who passed away and retained memories of its previous life, who carries a mask that was its human face, and who sometimes holds the mask up and weeps. The entry became notable enough to be widely circulated outside the community because its content was so unexpectedly affecting. The image of a small ghost wandering with a face it no longer wears, still mourning what it used to be, is genuinely melancholic in a way that the game's usual tone does not prepare the player for. The Yamask entry is interesting as an object in itself because it demonstrates that the designers of the Pokédex entries were willing at specific moments to insert material that functioned on a completely different emotional register from what surrounded it. Most Pokédex entries describe a creature's size, habitat, behaviors, and powers in ways that are informative and occasionally atmospheric, but rarely affecting in any deeper sense. The Yamask entry does something different, inviting a kind of empathy for a creature that the standard game mechanics treat as simply an opponent or a collectible. The entry does not ask the player to do anything differently. The game continues to function in its normal way regardless of whether the player has read it. But the information is there, a small piece of genuine sadness embedded in a document that mostly describes attack power and habitat preferences, and it changes slightly what it feels like to put a Yamask in a box. Another quiet detail appears when you examine how the franchise has handled the question of Pokemon with human-level or potentially superhuman intelligence across multiple generations. Mewtwo was the first significant example of a Pokemon whose intelligence was depicted as exceeding or equaling that of human beings, and the first film addressed the implications of this directly through Mewtwo's arc of awakening, questioning, and eventual rebellion. But subsequent generations continued to introduce Pokemon whose intelligence and awareness raised similar questions without necessarily addressing them. Gardevoir and Galad, which are described as willing to create black holes to protect their trainers. Alakazam, whose Pokédex entries describe it as possessing an IQ of 5,000. Porygon, a Pokémon made entirely of programming code that could enter cyberspace and manipulate digital environments. Each of these creatures, considered on its own terms, raises questions about what the Pokemon trainer relationship means for a being of that intelligence and capability. And the franchise's consistent choice to leave those questions unaddressed is itself a kind of answer, or at least a position. The development history of Pokemon during the period between Generation 3 and Generation 4 contains a significant event that altered the trajectory of the franchise in ways that were not widely understood until years later. Iwata Satoru, who had contributed programming work to Gold and Silver and had become the president of Nintendo, was deeply involved in the company's decisions about how to move Pokemon forward after the Game Boy Advance era. The decision to continue developing the main series games for Nintendo's own hardware rather than licensing them to external developers, and the decision to invest in making each generation a significant technical upgrade rather than simply incrementing the roster and region, reflected priorities that Iwata was positioned to enforce as company head. The influence of his involvement in the franchise's early technical development and his later position of oversight created a continuity of vision that might not have existed under different corporate circumstances. The caves in the Pokemon games have a history that is interesting independently of the creatures found inside them. The rock tunnel in Generation 1 was an optional but significant challenge. A large cave that could only be traversed without getting lost if the player had obtained the HM for Flash, which reduced the accuracy of wild Pokemon and made the encounters slightly less damaging. The tunnel was designed to be disorienting, with multiple paths that looped back on themselves, and a map that, if the player had not purchased the town map item, offered no guidance. Players who entered without Flash and without a reliable map experienced the tunnel as genuinely bewildering, a space that resisted easy navigation and punished impatience with additional encounters and wrong turns. The tunnel's design philosophy was one of authentic challenge, rather than the directed navigation that subsequent games would increasingly favor, and the experience of getting lost in it is remembered vividly by players who encountered it during the early period of the franchise. The Victory Road that precedes each game's Elite Four serves a different function from the ordinary caves and tunnels that players encounter earlier in their journeys, and the best examples of the design use this context with awareness. Victory Road is intended as the final test before the conclusion of the main story, a last challenge that filters out players who have not prepared adequately and provides a sense of arrival for those who have. The design of these areas across generations shows varying levels of commitment to this purpose. Some victory roads are genuinely challenging, requiring both navigation skill and strategic depth, while others are essentially corridors with slightly stronger wild Pokemon. The feeling of emerging from Victory Road and seeing the Pokemon League building for the first time is one of the franchise's recurring emotional beats, and how well that feeling lands depends significantly on how effectively the preceding area has functioned as a genuine test. The lore surrounding the Regi trio from Generation 3, Regirock, Regise, and Regsteel involves one of the more elaborate optional puzzle sequences in the franchise's history. To encounter the three creatures, players had to interpret a series of cryptic inscriptions found in ruins, each of which described a particular set of actions to be performed in a specific location using Pokemon with specific abilities. The puzzles were designed to be solvable without external assistance, but were obscure enough that many players completed the main story of Ruby and Sapphire without ever discovering that the Regi trio existed. The sequence of caves containing the creatures was built around Braille text that players had to either know how to read or look up, a level of obscurity unusual enough that official strategy guides sold significantly more copies in the weeks following the game's release than the franchise's usual strong guide sales would have predicted. The introduction of Regigigas in Generation 4 as the creator of the three original Regis extended the trilogy into a mythology with cosmological implications that the games explored with characteristic restraint. Regigigas was depicted in the Pokédex as having once pulled continents with ropes, a claim so extravagant that it positioned the creature as a participant in the geological history of the Pokémon world rather than simply a powerful battler. The decision to give Regigigas the slow start ability, which halves its attack and speed for the first 5 turns of every battle it participates in, made it one of the few legendary Pokémon whose competitive viability was severely limited by its own design, which some players found thematically appropriate and others simply found frustrating. The gap between Regigigas' in-lore power, sufficient to reshape continents, and its in-game competitive performance, often outperformed by far more ordinary Pokémon, is one of the more striking disconnects between narrative and mechanical representation in the franchise. The Unown, the alphabet-shaped Pokémon introduced in Generation 2, occupy a unique position in the franchise as creatures whose appearance is almost entirely symbolic. 28 unknown correspond to the 26 letters of the Latin alphabet and to a question mark and exclamation point, and the Pokédex describes them as one of the oldest Pokémon in existence, connected to ancient writing systems and potentially capable of collective action that far exceeds the capability of any individual member of the species. The ruins of Alf, where they are found in gold and silver, were designed as an archaeological site with puzzles involving sliding tile games that revealed imagery when solved, and the discovery of each unknown form required exploring different sections of the ruins in ways that rewarded thorough investigation. The creatures themselves have almost no competitive viability, possessing a single attack, hidden power, whose type varies by individual, and whose base power is fixed, making them effectively useless as battle Pokémon while making them extremely interesting as lore objects. The question of what Unown actually are, and what their connection to language and ancient history implies about the Pokémon world, has generated sustained speculation in the community that has outlasted the creature's mechanical irrelevance. If the Unknown are truly ancient, predating other Pokémon, their existence raises questions about the relationship between the Pokémon world's living beings and the symbolic systems that human civilizations develop. The third Pokémon film, Spell of the Unknown, took the creature's collective reality-altering capacity seriously enough to build its central conflict around it, depicting the Unknown as entities that manifested the unconscious desires of a child with sufficient emotional intensity to reshape physical reality. The film's treatment of them as dangerous, not through malice, but through indiscriminate power, was one of its more interesting choices, positioning the Unknown as forces that simply responded to the emotional needs of nearby consciousness rather than creatures with intentions of their own. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Generation 2 handled its sense of place relative to the original games, and notice how carefully the designers controlled the feeling of returning to a known region. The player of Gold and Silver was able to visit Kanto after completing the Johto story, but the Kanto encountered in those games was deliberately different from the Kanto of Red and Blue. The gym leaders had changed their teams and their personalities. Some areas were visually distinct from how they appeared in the first games. The feeling of the region was subtly altered, haunted by time in ways that the original games could not have anticipated. This sense of familiar places made strange by the passage of time is one of the emotional achievements of Gold and Silver that its reputation accurately captures, and the decision to set the post-game in a changed version of a beloved region rather than in an entirely new area was a choice that carried significant creative risk and significant emotional payoff. The soundtrack transition between regions in Gold and Silver, the moment when the player crossed from Johto into Kanto, and the music shifted to the themes of the original games presented in new arrangements, was one of the franchise's most effective single gestures. The arrangements were recognizable as the original themes while being subtly different, updated to take advantage of the Game Boy Color's audio capabilities in ways that made them sound richer and somehow older than the originals, as if they had acquired a patina through the years that had passed in the story. The effect was that returning to Kanto felt exactly like it should feel, like coming back to a place you knew, changed enough to feel like the passage of time had been real, familiar enough to produce the recognition that memory insists on. The concept of version exclusives and the trading requirement for completion has generated one of the franchise's longest running design conversations, with each new release producing fresh debate about whether the structure still made sense in an era when trading could be arranged more easily than the original link cable system had permitted. The original design was rooted in a practical reality about how children socialized in the late 1990s. Trading Pokemon required physical proximity, a compatible device, and a cable, which meant that the exchange had to be negotiated in person and completed in a shared space. This physical requirement was a feature rather than a limitation, because it created a reason for the games to be part of conversations and social exchanges that might otherwise not occur. The modern trading infrastructure, which allows players to connect with partners anywhere in the world without any physical mediation, removes the social function while retaining the structure, and the conversation about whether the structure has outlived its original purpose is one that the community revisits with each new generation. The Pokemon contests introduced in Generation 3 as an alternative competitive activity, allowing players to compete with their Pokemon based on appearance and appeal rather than battle statistics, represented a design decision that acknowledged the existence of a portion of the player base for whom the battle system was less interesting than the collecting and aesthetic dimensions of the franchise. The contests were elaborated and expanded in Generation 4, where they became the Pokemon Super Contests with more complex judging criteria, and in Generation 6, where aspects of non-combat Pokemon engagement were introduced in Pokemon Amy and subsequent mechanics designed to deepen the relationship between player and Pokemon outside of battle. This strand of the franchise's design, the attempt to provide meaningful non-combat engagement that could be as rewarding as the battle system for players drawn to it, has been one of the more consistently pursued ambitions in the series' history, even if the implementations have varied in how successfully they realized it. The story of Pokemon's development in the period between its Japanese launch and its international release contains some remarkable facts about how the franchise was perceived before it became a global phenomenon. Nintendo of America, upon reviewing the games before their American release, reportedly considered not localizing them at all, concerned that the complexity of the collection system and the trading requirement would not appeal to American children. The localization that eventually occurred, which included the anime series arriving in the United States at nearly the same time as the games, was accompanied by a marketing campaign that has become something of a case study in how to build a franchise across multiple media simultaneously. The success of the American launch exceeded the expectations of everyone involved, including those who had been confident enough to push for it, and the resulting cultural moment, visible in the trading card shortages and school banning of cards that characterized the franchise's peak cultural visibility in 1999, was genuinely unprecedented for a video game franchise at that point in the medium's history. The quality of the localization work done for the English language release, which involved not just translation, but the creation of English names for the creatures that captured something of the designs and etymological logic of the originals, is often underappreciated in discussions of the franchise's success. The naming of Pokémon involves a kind of wordplay that works across languages in different ways, with Japanese names drawing on Japanese words and cultural references, while English names draw on English roots, and the challenge of recreating the internal logic of the naming system in a language with completely different phonetic properties and cultural references produce some genuinely inventive solutions. Names like Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Jengar, and Alakazam had to feel right in ways that were related to, but not identical with the qualities that made their Japanese originals feel right, and the people who developed the English naming conventions were doing creative work that shaped the experience of an entire generation of players who never heard the Japanese originals. The tournament scene for the main series games developed from informal community organized competitions in the early years to official sanctioned circuits, including regional championships, national championships, and the world championships that have been held annually since 2009. The development of this competitive infrastructure changed the franchise's relationship to a segment of its audience in ways that both enriched and complicated the experience. Players who participated in the competitive scene developed deep expertise in the game's mechanics that most casual players never approached, expertise that was both rewarding in itself and difficult to communicate to people outside the community. The gap between casual play and competitive play in Pokémon is larger than in most other competitive games, because so much of the game's depth is genuinely hidden from players who are not specifically looking for it, and the competitive scene developed in ways that were largely invisible to the players who were not involved in it. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes possible to see the iceberg as not as a collection of separate facts, but as a connected structure, with each layer supporting those above it and being supported by those below. Near the surface are the things that even casual players have encountered: the truck, missing no, the Lavender Town music, the GS ball that was never opened. These facts are known so widely because they are attached to experiences and emotions that most Pokemon players share, and the shared emotional texture of those experiences makes the associated facts easy to transmit and easy to remember. Below these, the facts become less universally experienced and more specific to particular kinds of engagement with the franchise, the development histories, the competitive mechanics, the lore embedded in Pokédex entries, the design process visible in the Space World demos, and the leaked Generation 3 files. Deeper still are the things that require sustained and specific kinds of attention to find at all: the unknown lore and its implications for the world's cosmology, the specific emotional logic of particular pieces of music, the development circumstances that shaped the franchise at moments of transition between generations, the subtle ways in which the game's design choices have accumulated over decades into an aesthetic and philosophical position about what games can be and what experiences they can provide. These layers are not less real than the surface layers. They are simply less visible to people who have not spent significant time looking for them, and the iceberg image captures this not just as a metaphor for the unknown, but as a metaphor for the value of sustained attention. The deeper layers reward exactly the kind of slow and patient looking that nighttime exploration provides, and the story of the Pokémon franchise, considered with that patience, is considerably richer than its surface suggests. The Pokémon franchise's relationship to nostalgia is one of the more complex aspects of its cultural position, because it is a franchise that has been creating nostalgia since 1996, and whose player base now includes multiple generations with distinct nostalgic attachments to different periods of its history. Players who grew up with Red and Blue feel a particular relationship to those games and their aesthetic that players who came in with Gold and Silver do not share, and those players in turn have attachments that players who began with Ruby and Sapphire do not fully understand. The franchise has had to navigate this layered nostalgia in its design decisions, finding ways to honor the emotional investments of earlier players without making the games inaccessible or alienating to new ones. The remake series, which has produced updated versions of the original Japanese releases at fairly regular intervals, represents one solution to this navigation, allowing the franchise to revisit and honor its history while providing the updated mechanics and aesthetics that contemporary players expect. The question of what the Pokémon franchise means in the context of the broader history of role playing games is one that academic game studies has begun to address with increasing seriousness, and the conclusions of that engagement tend to emphasize the franchise's role in expanding who played role playing games and what experiences those games could offer. Role playing games before Pokémon were largely associated with a fairly specific audience, predominantly older players willing to engage with high mechanical complexity and often without accessible tutorials or guidance systems. Pokémon demonstrated that role playing game mechanics, stripped to their essential structure and embedded in a context that was visually appealing and emotionally intuitive, could attract players who had never considered themselves role playing game players at all, and the demographic expansion that followed helped establish the genre's position in contemporary gaming culture. The ending sequences of the mainline Pokémon games have been designed with varying levels of attention to the emotional dimension of completion, and the most effective of them reflect a genuine understanding of what it means to have spent 30 or 40 or 60 hours with a particular set of creatures and environments and characters before reaching a final credit sequence. The ending of Pokémon Black and White, which involved AN departing with his legendary Pokémon to seek a truth that neither he nor the player was fully equipped to articulate, and which was followed by a post-game exploration that provided more questions than answers, was notable for taking the emotional weight of completion seriously. The ending of Gold and Silver, which led the player to the summit of a mountain to face the silent protagonist of the previous generation in a battle that required no explanation, was effective for entirely different reasons. Both were attentive to the fact that something ends when a game does, and that the best endings acknowledge the texture of the experience rather than simply marking its conclusion. The continued existence of the Pokémon anime, which by most accounts has aired more than 1,000 episodes and continues to produce new content more than 2 decades after its original premiere, represents a creative achievement that is difficult to fully appreciate until you consider how unusual sustained franchise media production at that scale actually is. The anime has changed dramatically since its original episodes, cycling through different protagonist setups, different regional settings, and different approaches to the relationship between Ash and the creatures and people he encounters. The decision announced to retire Ash as the protagonist after he achieved his lifelong goal of becoming world champion was treated by the community as something genuinely significant, because the character had been the anchor of the anime for so long that his presence had become part of the franchise's identity rather than simply its storytelling vehicle. His final episodes attracted attention from players who had not followed the anime in years, returning to see the conclusion of something that had begun during their childhoods. Another quiet detail appears when you consider what the retirement of Ash as protagonist revealed about how deeply the franchise had embedded itself in the emotional lives of people who had grown up with it. Adults who had moved far beyond the stage of life when they might normally engage with children's animation found themselves watching the final Ash episodes, not primarily because they were interested in the content, but because the ending of something that had been present throughout their childhoods constituted a small but genuine event. The franchise had always operated at the intersection of childhood and memory in ways that gave its content a weight beyond its immediate entertainment value, and the moment of Ash's conclusion made that weight briefly visible in the response it provoked from people who might otherwise not have thought about the franchise in years. The iceberg, followed to its deepest layers, eventually opens into questions about what makes the Pokémon franchise itself significant as a cultural object and as an experience. These are not questions with simple answers, and they are not the kind of questions that the franchise's surface typically invites. But the fact that the franchise has been generating conversation at every layer of depth for more than 25 years, that it has accumulated a mythology and a body of lore, and a competitive scene, and a fan creative tradition, and a neuroscientific footnote, and an ongoing philosophical conversation about the ethics of its central premise suggests that the initial design contained more genuine depth than even its creators might have anticipated. The truck was a piece of environmental decoration. Missing No was a programming artifact. The GS ball was an abandoned plot thread. But the community's sustained engagement with each of these things, and with everything deeper, reflects a franchise that was built on ideas rich enough to repay exactly this kind of patient, thorough, gentle attention. The stories gathered in the deepest layers of the Pokémon Iceberg are not stories about secrets or about shocking revelations, but about the texture of a creative work considered carefully over time. They are stories about how things were made, why certain choices were made instead of others, how the community interpreted and extended and transformed what the designers created, how the franchise changed and what it retained, how a set of ideas about collecting insects and exploring neighborhoods and trading discoveries with friends became something that has occupied a place in the imaginative lives of several consecutive generations of children around the world. These stories are worth telling slowly, in the manner of things that earn their meaning through patience rather than delivering it all at once, because that is how their meaning actually works. It accumulates, it deepens, it becomes something more than the sum of its parts. The question of what Pokemon games owe to the players who grew up with them and then kept returning is one that the franchise has answered differently in different eras. The remasters and remakes and enhanced editions, the decisions about which mechanics to carry forward and which to leave behind. All of these reflect an ongoing negotiation between what was loved and what was limiting, between honoring the original experience and acknowledging that the original experience was made under constraints that no longer apply. The most successful releases in the franchise's history have tended to be those that understood this negotiation clearly and found solutions that satisfied returning players without asking them to pretend that nothing had changed since the first time they held a Game Boy. The least successful have sometimes been those that either retreated entirely into nostalgia or abandoned it entirely, failing to acknowledge that the relationship between the franchise and its longest-term players is a genuine relationship with its own history and its own expectations. The experience of playing Pokémon as a child and then returning to the same games as an adult produces a specific quality of recognition that is different from other kinds of revisiting. The games are designed for children, and encountering them again with adult cognition reveals the architecture of their design in ways that are not available to the child who plays them for the first time. The tile-based movement, the turn-based combat system, the simplified probability of random encounters, all of these are visible as design choices rather than as the natural laws of the world. But alongside this architectural visibility comes a different kind of experience, the emotional memory of what it felt like to navigate these systems before they were transparent, when the world was large and the outcomes were uncertain. Adults who return to Pokémon are playing two games simultaneously, the designed object and the remembered experience, and the particular quality of that doubled engagement is one of the things that makes the franchise's cultural footprint so durable. The Pokémon franchise's design of its routes and paths, the roads that connect towns and contain the wild encounters that form the texture of the journey, has been handled differently across generations in ways that accumulate into a philosophy of travel. The early game's routes were not designed to be completed quickly. Flash, strength, cut, surf, each hidden machine move opened new areas and created reasons to return. The sense of a map opening gradually, revealing connections between spaces that had seemed separate, gave the experience of completing a region a quality of earned understanding. The player who reached the end of the game had built a mental model of the world through the experience of traveling it, and that model felt like knowledge of a real place rather than completion of a stage-by-stage progression. Later games have generally been more linear in their design, offering cleaner progression at the expense of the slightly disorienting but ultimately rewarding complexity of the earlier approach. The fan art tradition within the Pokemon community is one of the most active in any video game franchise, and its existence over nearly 3 decades has produced a body of creative work that occupies an interesting position relative to the official franchise. Some fan art is straightforwardly celebratory, reproducing or extending the official aesthetic in ways that the franchise itself would probably approve of. Other fan art engages with the darker, stranger, or more philosophically complex aspects of the franchise's design, exploring what the Pokemon world might look like if its implications were taken more seriously, if the creatures were as dangerous as their Pokedex entries suggest, if the trainer-Pokemon relationship were examined with more ambiguity. The Iceberg's deepest community layers include this tradition of fan art as interpretation, as a reading of the franchise that the official materials never quite perform, but that the design richly supports. The lore of the Pokemon world extends into domains that the games themselves only gesture toward, and one of those domains is music. The in-universe explanation for certain events and phenomena in the games sometimes involves music as an active force rather than a background element. The Soothe Bell item, which increases a Pokemon's happiness when held, implies that certain sounds carry properties that affect creatures in ways that go beyond mere sensory experience. The Poke Flute that woke the sleeping Snorlax in the original games, the Pokemon that responded to specific melodies in Generation 4, the various legendary Pokemon whose appearances were connected to particular sounds or instruments, all of these details suggest a world in which music is understood to have a more direct relationship to the behavior and well-being of creatures than it does in ours. The franchise's actual music carries this implication in how it was composed, with the designers of battle themes and town themes clearly understanding that what they were making would become part of the emotional memory of millions of children, would become in some sense the sound of a world. The hidden lore of the Pokemon world, as assembled through careful reading of Pokedex entries, environmental text, and NPC dialogue across all generations, reveals a civilization that has had a much longer and more turbulent history than the game's cheerful present-day settings suggest. Ruins appear in almost every region, and the civilizations that built them are described in terms that suggest they were substantially different from the contemporary societies the player encounters. The ancient Pokemon world contained conflicts over legendary Pokemon that reportedly altered the physical landscape, wars whose consequences still shape the geography of regions like Sinnoh and Kalos, and cultural practices around Pokemon that were more intense and more morally complex than the contemporary relationship between trainer and partner. The present-day world of the games, sunny and accessible, is built on this more turbulent history, and the traces of it appear in the ruins and the restricted areas and the legends that characters pass on to the player in quiet moments between gym battles. The Kalos region of Generation 6 contains some of the most explicitly handled historical darkness in the franchise, in the form of the backstory of the villain Lysandra and the history of the weapon hidden beneath Lumiosa's city. The weapon, called the Ultimate Weapon by the game, was constructed 3,000 years before the game's present day by the king of ancient Kalos, who lost the person he loved in a great war and built a device capable of destroying all life on a continental scale in order to bring that person back from death. The weapon was used, resulting in the resurrection of the king's love and the deaths of countless Pokemon who gave their life force to power it. This backstory is unusually dark for the franchise even by the standards of its darker moments, depicting not a villain motivated by power or ideology, but a person motivated by grief, who made a choice whose consequences were catastrophic and who then lived for 3,000 years, functionally immortal, burdened with what he had done. The presence of this backstory in a game designed primarily for children is the same kind of design choice that produces the Yamask Pokédex entry, a moment where the franchise does not soften its material to the point of falseness. The darkness is present, and the game trusts players to engage with it at whatever depth matches their capacity. Younger players will register that something bad happened in the ancient past and move on to the gym battles. Older players will sit with the image of someone building a weapon of mass destruction out of love and grief and living for 3,000 years in the knowledge of what they did. Both experiences are available in the same text, which is the franchise at its best, transparent in its surface, layered in its depth. The specific detail that the King of Ancient Kalos and AZ, the ancient figure encountered late in Pokémon X and Y, are the same character, 3,000 years old, and still living as a consequence of the ultimate weapon's activation, is delivered near the end of the game in a sequence that is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention. Azid is introduced as a strange and very tall old man who appears periodically near Lumiose City, not explained or identified until the game's conclusion. The reveal of his identity and history is handled with restraint, giving the player enough information to understand the depth of what he experienced without dramatizing it beyond what the material requires. The final scene with AZ, in which his Pokemon companion from 3,000 years ago returns to him, is one of the most affecting moments in the franchise's later history, using the simple visual of reunion to carry the weight of 3,000 years of waiting. The question of continuity between the game series and the anime series has generated sustained discussion in the community because the two properties have never been explicitly reconciled. The anime follows Ash Ketchum through a world that is recognizably the same as the game world in its geography and its roster of Pokemon, but that diverges from the games in countless specific ways, from the behavior of individual Pokemon to the structure of the Pokemon League to the personalities of the characters who occupy the same names and roles as characters in the games. The question of whether the anime and the games are set in the same world or in parallel worlds with the same basic structure but different details is one that the franchise has never answered directly, allowing the two properties to coexist without requiring either to conform to the other's continuity. The design of Pokemon for competitive utility has occasionally produced creatures whose appearance or concept bears little relationship to what makes them competitively interesting. Smeargle, the painter Pokemon introduced in Generation 2, is described as a creature that uses the fluid secreted from its tail to paint murals and marks its territory with its signature, called a smear. In competitive play, Smeargle is interesting because of its ability sketch, which allows it to permanently learn any move it observes an opposing Pokemon use, making it in principle capable of having access to any combination of 4 moves in the game. The gap between Smeargle's competitive role, which is primarily about accessing specific combinations of moves that no other Pokemon can legally learn together, and its thematic identity as a painter, is one of the more amusing examples of the franchise's ability to produce competitive depth from unexpected directions. The history of Pokemon event distributions, in which certain mythical Pokemon could only be obtained by attending physical events or by connecting to online distribution services during specific time windows, represents a design tradition that has had complicated implications for the franchise's relationship to completeness. Players who attended events obtained access to Pokemon that players who did not attend could never legitimately obtain, creating a permanent stratification in the collection community between those who happened to be present at specific times and places and those who were not. Some event distributions were geographically limited, available only in specific countries, which meant that the complete collection of all legally obtainable Pokémon required either extraordinary geographic mobility or participation in trading networks that brought event Pokémon from the regions where they were available to players who had not been able to attend. The mythical Pokémon distributed through events have included some of the franchise's most narratively interesting creatures. Celebi, the time-traveling grass and psychic type first seen in the GS Ball storyline, was for years available only through specific Nintendo events and was central to the backstory of the fourth film. Jirachi, the wish-granting steel and psychic type from Generation 3, was distributed alongside a theatrical release and through bonus discs bundled with other games. The narrative weight attached to some of these distributions, the sense that obtaining the event Pokémon was a meaningful moment rather than simply a data transfer, was partly a function of their connection to animated films or other media events. The ritual of attending a distribution, connecting a Game Boy to a special kiosk, and receiving a creature that no one else had, carried a quality that later online distributions simplified away while losing some of the occasion. The concept of Pokémon habitats and ecology has been explored more extensively in some games than others, and the approach has shifted considerably between generations. The original games placed Pokémon in specific locations without explaining why those locations were appropriate, relying on the player's willingness to accept the distribution as given. Later games, particularly the Pokédex entries and the environmental design of games like Pokémon Legends, Arceus, attempted to make the placement of Pokémon feel more ecologically grounded, with creatures appearing in habitats that made sense for their biology and behavior. The open-world approach of the newer games allowed players to observe Pokémon interacting with their environment in real time rather than encountering them only in abstracted battle sequences, which created a different quality of engagement with the world as a living place. The presence of water-based routes and sea-crossing mechanics in the franchise has produced some of the more technically interesting moments in the game's history. The experience of surfing across open water in the original games, with wild Pokémon appearing in the featureless blue beneath the player character, has a quality of isolation that most land-based routes do not produce. The combination of that visual openness with the relatively limited variety of Pokémon available in deep water created a particular texture of travel that players who have spent hours crossing Hoenn's ocean routes remember with mixed feelings, the genuine sensation of open water alongside the repetitive encounters with the same creatures. This tension between atmospheric success and gameplay monotony is one of the recurring design challenges of the water-oriented regions, and the franchise's various attempts to resolve it have produced different solutions of varying effectiveness. The fishing mechanic, which has appeared in some form in every mainline Pokémon game, represents the franchise's attempt to provide a slower, more patient form of exploration than walking through tall grass. The three fishing rods of the original games, the Old Rod, Good Rod, and Super Rod, each accessed different sets of Pokémon from any given body of water, creating a layered accessibility system that rewarded players who acquired better equipment. The specific Pokémon available from fishing were often different from those available through surfing in the same body of water, creating a reason to engage with the mechanic even when the water had already been explored via surfing. Later generations simplified and modified the fishing mechanic in various ways, but its presence across the franchise's entire history suggests that Game Freak has consistently valued having at least one form of Pokémon acquisition that required patience and deliberate attention rather than simply moving through a space and encountering whatever appeared. The relationship between Pokémon design and the natural world has been one of the more thoughtfully handled aspects of the franchise's visual language. Each Pokémon's design begins, in most cases, from some observable characteristic of a real organism, mineral, phenomenon, or cultural object, And the transformation from that starting point to a finished design involves the same process of abstraction and creative interpretation that the beta Pokemon files reveal in their earlier stages. The best Pokemon designs feel simultaneously familiar and novel, recognizable enough that their inspiration can be identified, but creative enough that they feel like original creations rather than illustrations of existing things. The franchise's remarkable design consistency across hundreds of different creatures and dozens of different designers over nearly 3 decades reflects a set of shared principles about what makes a design feel like a Pokemon rather than something else. And those principles are visible, though never fully explicit, in the iceberg's deeper layers. The franchise's relationship to Japan and to Japanese culture is present in the designs and lore of every generation, but has been handled with increasing awareness of the need to make cultural references accessible to an international audience. The earliest games drew extensively from Japanese folklore, architecture, and geography in ways that were relatively transparent, with cities based on real Japanese locations and Pokemon designs inspired by creatures from Japanese mythology. Later generations, particularly those set in regions based on European geography, engaged with different cultural traditions while maintaining the underlying design sensibilities developed through the franchise's Japanese roots. This navigation between cultural specificity and international accessibility is one of the franchise's ongoing creative challenges, and the iceberg contains many layers of analysis about how well different generations have managed it. The legacy of the franchise's original aesthetic, established through Sugimori's distinctive illustration style, has cast a long shadow over every subsequent generation of design. Sugimori's original designs had a particular quality of rounded clarity that made them immediately legible and pleasant to look at while still conveying a range of different emotional registers, from the cute to the threatening to the strange. As the franchise grew and the roster expanded, maintaining that quality of legibility across an increasingly diverse range of inspirations required consistent application of the underlying design principles rather than simple imitation of the original aesthetic. The designs that feel most cohesive within the franchise, regardless of which generation they come from, tend to be those that have internalized those principles deeply enough to apply them to new territory rather than simply following the visual conventions of their era. The tournament scene's development beyond the official competitive format has included a community-run set of formats that address aspects of competitive play that the official formats do not, and these community formats have sometimes produced gameplay experiences that players found more interesting or more balanced than the official formats. The Anything Goes format, which permits all Pokemon, including those banned from other formats, produces a metagame dominated by the most powerful legendary Pokemon in ways that are sometimes criticized for removing strategic variety, but that are also genuinely interesting as an exploration of what happens when no limits are imposed. The Ubers tier within the broader Smogon tier system, which collects Pokemon too powerful for standard play into their own competitive environment, similarly creates a space where the game's most extreme designs interact in ways that illuminate the upper boundaries of what the system can support. The question of how Pokemon abilities were developed and named is one of the franchise's more technically interesting design histories. Generation 3 introduced approximately 80 abilities at launch, each assigned to specific Pokemon in a distribution that was not entirely explained by lore and was partly designed around competitive balance considerations. Some abilities were clearly designed to make specific Pokemon more viable competitively without changing their overall design, while others seemed to arise directly from the creature's biological or mythological identity. The ability Levitate, which removed the holder's ground-type vulnerability, was given to a set of Pokemon that the design team presumably decided should logically be immune to ground-based attacks due to their manner of movement. The ability Intimidate, which lowered the opposing Pokemon's attack when the holder entered battle, was given to Pokemon with aggressive or imposing designs. These assignments were not always internally consistent, but the general logic of aligning abilities with creature identity was present and contributed to making the ability system feel connected to the world rather than purely mechanical. The anniversary releases and remakes that the franchise has produced across its history represent both a commercial strategy and a design tradition with its own accumulated expectations. The remakes of Fire Red and Leaf Green, released in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance, established a template that was refined with Heart Gold and Soul Silver in 2009 and continued with subsequent remake pairs. Each remake generation has had to navigate the tension between faithfulness to the original experience, which players who remember the originals often value highly, and the necessity of updating the games enough to feel current and to make the most of available hardware. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are frequently cited as the most successful execution of this balance, retaining the emotional texture of the original Gold and Silver while adding content and features that deepened the experience for returning players without overwhelming or confusing players who were coming to Johto for the first time. The distinctive walking Pokemon feature of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which allowed the player's lead Pokemon to follow them visibly on the overworld map rather than remaining inside a Pokeball during travel, became one of the most fondly remembered features in the franchise's history, and its absence from subsequent games was noticed and lamented by a significant portion of the community. The feature was technically demanding, requiring unique walking animations for each of the nearly 500 Pokemon available in those games, and its omission from subsequent titles was likely partly a resource decision rather than a creative one. But the response to its absence suggests that it addressed something genuine about how players wanted to experience their relationship with their Pokemon, a desire for visible companionship rather than the abstraction of creatures existing only inside a ball until called upon for battle. The relationship between the Pokemon franchise and the broader history of monster collecting games and media is a thread that runs through the iceberg without being one of its central stories, but is worth noting in passing because it illuminates something about why the franchise succeeded where contemporaries and competitors did not always succeed. The genre that Pokemon helped establish, or at least dramatically popularize, has produced many entries over the decades since the original game's release, and some of those entries have been genuinely successful. But the franchise itself has maintained a position of preeminence within the genre that seems disproportionate to any single feature or mechanic advantage it holds, suggesting that its success is rooted in something more diffuse, the combination of design quality, timing, cultural embedding, and the depth of the community that grew up around it. The iceberg, in its entirety, is part of the explanation for why the franchise occupies the position it does. A franchise that generates this kind of sustained, detailed, affectionate attention from its community is not a franchise that can be straightforwardly surpassed by a competitor with better mechanics, because the mechanics are only part of what the franchise is. As we drift gently toward the surface of this long exploration, through the dark and layered water of all that has been noticed and all that remains to be noticed, the shape of the iceberg becomes clearer from below than it ever was from above. The surface facts, the truck and the glitch, and the abandoned storyline and the ghost without a walking animation, these are not the trivial parts of the iceberg that the deeper secrets make meaningful. They are the same kind of thing as the deeper secrets, viewed from a greater distance, made familiar by repetition and the accumulation of shared conversation. Every layer of the iceberg was once the deepest layer someone had found, and every deep layer now has someone who found it first and told someone else, who told someone else, until the finding became community knowledge and the depth became another surface. The iceberg never runs out of depth. New generations add new content and new mysteries. New analytical tools allow players to examine the game's data with a precision that earlier players could not achieve. New community members bring fresh attention to things that longtime players have stopped noticing. Old save files fail, and the Pokemon that lived in them are gone, creating absences that are their own kind of hidden layer. The franchise's history continues to accumulate, and the iceberg grows as it is explored, acquiring new layers at the bottom as the community maps what is already known at the top. What remains at the end of this particular journey through those layers is not a comprehensive accounting of everything the iceberg contains, because no single journey through it could be comprehensive. What remains is a sense of the shape of the thing, the feeling of its depth, the particular texture of attention that it rewards. The truck was not hiding Mew. Missing No was not a secret. The GS ball did not contain what it might have contained, but the desire to find what was hidden, to know what was inside, to follow every thread to its conclusion, that desire was real, and the franchise has been a worthy object for it for nearly 3 decades. The Pokémon Iceberg is, in the end, a record of that desire and all the places it has gone. It is a map of what happens when millions of people pay close attention to something they love over a very long time. And the fact that the attention has been this sustained, this detailed, this